He owned the building, every floor, every window, every conference room where men in $1,000 suits decided the fates of thousands. He signed their paychecks, approved their bonuses, and could end their careers with a single phone call. But that Tuesday morning, Nathan Cole stood in the service hallway of his own company, wearing a gray uniform with someone else's name stitched above the chest pocket, pushing a mop bucket that squealed with every turn of the wheel. And not a single person looked at him. Not one. That invisibility was exactly what he needed. What he wasn't prepared for was her. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 4:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because Nathan Cole had not actually been asleep. He'd been lying on his back in the dark of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling the way he'd been doing most nights for the past 3 years. Not thinking about anything specific, just existing in that gray, restless space between exhaustion and awareness that had become his version of rest. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. On the nightstand, his phone glowed with 17 unread emails, 2 missed calls from the head of corporate security, and 1 text from his daughter's school reminding him about Picture Day on Thursday. He'd forgotten about Picture Day. He sat up, rubbed both hands over his face, and stayed that way for a moment, elbows on knees, head bowed, like a man in a locker room before a game he wasn't sure he could win. Then he got up and started his day. What? The bag had been packed the night before and hidden in the back of his walk-in closet behind a row of Italian suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Inside it, a gray janitor's uniform, slightly worn at the elbows, purchased from a uniform supply store on the south side of Chicago using cash. A clip-on name badge that read Daniel Brooks in plain black letters. A pair of scuffed work boots, size 11. A cheap digital watch with a scratched face. He'd stood in the uniform supply store for almost 15 minutes, turning the badge over in his hands, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not embarrassment, not pride exactly. Something more unsettling than either. The faint, uncomfortable awareness that he was about to find out something about his own company that he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Nathan Cole had built Veil Dynamics from a mid-size freight coordination firm into one of the most powerful logistics conglomerates in the Midwest. 1,100 employees across 6 offices, contracts with 4 of the top 10 retailers in the country, a glass tower in the Chicago Loop with his company's name etched into the lobby floor in brushed steel. He was 32 years old, and he'd done all of it in 8 years, 2 of which he'd spent as a widower raising a 5-year-old girl by himself. He was also apparently running a company where the people who kept the building functioning every single day were treated like furniture. The complaints had started arriving 8 months ago. Quietly at first, the way bad things usually do. An anonymous HR survey that came back with language that made the HR director uncomfortable enough to flag it. Then a formal complaint from a warehouse supervisor in the satellite office in Evanston. Then 3 more from different departments, all saying variations of the same thing. This company's culture eats people alive, and leadership doesn't care. One email, from a cleaning staff supervisor named Irene Moss, had been particularly specific. She described executives leaving trash on the floors near garbage cans as a kind of power statement. She described a VP who told a maintenance worker to disappear during a client tour because the worker's uniform was bad optics. She described the way certain senior staff spoke to cleaning crews, not with cruelty exactly, but with the practiced, thoughtless indifference of people who had simply stopped seeing other people as people. Nathan had read Irene's email 3 times. Then he'd called Marcus Webb, his head of HR, and asked him to investigate. 3 weeks later, Marcus came back with a report so carefully worded and professionally vague that it said almost nothing while appearing to say everything. All concerns had been reviewed. Appropriate sensitivity training was being explored. The situation had been monitored closely. Nathan had read that report once, put it down on his desk, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Chicago skyline for a long time. He understood, in that moment, that the problem was not going to be solved by another report. So he decided to see it himself. He told no one, not Marcus, not his assistant, Dana, who had worked for him for 5 years and could read his mood from across a room, not his head of security, not his driver, whom he'd given the week off with a vague explanation about personal travel. The only person who knew anything was his mother, who was staying at the house for the week to look after his daughter, Lily. "Papa, where are you going?" Lily had asked that morning, padding into the kitchen in her socks while he was making her breakfast. Scrambled eggs, slightly overdone on the edges the way she inexplicably preferred them. She was 7 now. She had her mother's eyes, dark and serious, and a gap between her front teeth that she'd recently stopped being self-conscious about. "Work," he said. "You always go to work." "I know." She climbed onto the bar stool at the kitchen island and watched him plate the eggs. "Are you going to be home for dinner?" "I'll try." She considered this. "You always say that." He set the plate in front of her and met her eyes. "I'll be home for dinner," he said, with enough certainty that she seemed to decide to believe him. He hugged her before he left, held on for 3 seconds longer than usual, and then walked out into the cold March morning carrying his duffel bag and wearing a jacket that didn't belong to him. Whoosh. The service entrance to Vail Dynamics Tower was on a side street off Wacker Drive, easily missed unless you knew to look for it. A plain metal door with a keypad opening onto a narrow corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. Nathan had arranged, through a circuitous chain of intermediaries that couldn't be traced back to him, to have Daniel Brooks added to the facility's staff roster for a 5-day assignment. He'd insisted on being placed on the general cleaning rotation, not in any restricted area where his face might be recognized, and he'd requested the early morning through late afternoon shift. Ernesto Guzman, the facility's supervisor, met him at the service entrance at 6:15 and looked him over the way people look at new employees, quick, assessing, not particularly interested. "Daniel?" Ernesto said. "Yes, sir," Nathan said. Ernesto handed him a laminated orientation sheet. "You've been a janitor before." "A while back." Ernesto nodded. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick black mustache and the permanently tired expression of someone who managed things that no one ever thanked him for. "You'll be on the east wing of floors 12 through 15 this week. I'll show you where the supply closets are. You got any questions about the schedule? You come to me directly. Not to building management, not to any of the VPs, not to anyone except me. Understood?" "Understood." "And don't use the executive elevators." He said this without inflection, like a rule so basic it barely needed stating. "Those are for the office staff." Nathan followed him through the corridor without saying anything. The first 2 days were a study in architecture and invisibility. Nathan learned the rhythm of the building. When the executive floors filled up, when the conference rooms cycled through their parade of meetings, which hallways got heavy foot traffic after lunch, and which ones stayed quiet enough that you could hear the building's ventilation system humming in the walls. He learned the geography of the supply closets, the specific squeak of the mop bucket wheel that he eventually silenced with a drop of machine oil from a maintenance kit, the way the floor on 14 had a slight warp near the south stairwell that made mopping it require an adjusted stroke. He was good at the physical work, better than he'd expected. He was in decent shape from years of early morning gym sessions, and he had the kind of quiet stubbornness about repetitive tasks that his mother had always called his bulldog streak. What he was not good at, what knocked him slightly off balance every time it happened, was the way people looked through him, or didn't look at him at all. On the morning of his first day, he was mopping the hallway outside the 14th floor conference rooms when 3 directors walked past in a knot of conversation. One of them stepped directly into the wet area without slowing down, looked down at the floor with mild irritation, and said to no one in particular, "Can't they put a sign out?" Then kept walking. Nathan watched them go and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger exactly, something older and quieter. Recognition. He put the wet floor sign out, then kept mopping. By Tuesday afternoon, he'd started cataloging what he saw the way he cataloged problems in boardrooms. Systematically, without immediate judgment. He watched a junior executive drop a coffee cup on the floor 12 feet from a trash bin, look at it for a moment, and walk away. He watched a senior marketing manager speak to one of the other cleaning staff, a young woman named Patrice, in the clipped, zero-eye contact tone of someone ordering from a drive-thru. He watched a cluster of trainees from the Summit program, a group of around 20 young executives from Vail's partner companies who were in the building for a 2-week professional development summit, navigate the common areas with the slightly bewildered, slightly self-important energy of people who knew they were being evaluated and were performing accordingly. He noticed which ones held doors. He noticed which ones didn't. He noticed the woman on Wednesday morning. He was in the process of replacing a trash liner in the hallway just outside the main summit conference room when the argument started inside. Not loud enough to make out words through the closed door, but with a particular tension to its rhythm. The kind of room where someone is talking over someone else, repeatedly, in the guise of discussion. Nathan recognized the sound. He'd been in enough boardrooms to know exactly what it felt like from the inside. The polished aggression, the strategic interruption, the way certain rooms rewarded whoever was willing to talk loudest and longest without actually saying more. The door swung open at 9:23, and the woman walked out. She was around 30, and she moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who had learned to manage strong emotions in professional spaces, which meant, if you knew what to look for, that she was currently furious. Her jaw was set at a very specific angle. Her posture was perfectly straight. She was carrying a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield, and her right hand was gripping the edge of it hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. She stopped in the hallway, looked at the ceiling briefly, exhaled through her nose. Then she noticed Nathan struggling with the supply cart. One of the back wheels had jammed against a seam in the carpet, and the heavy load of replacement liners and cleaning supplies was making it difficult to maneuver without dragging it, which would scratch the floor. She put the portfolio down against the wall, walked over, took hold of the front of the cart without a word, and lifted slightly, relieving the pressure on the stuck wheel. "Try it now," she said. He pushed. The cart rolled free. "Thank you," he said, genuinely surprised. "The carpet seams are the worst on this floor," she said, picking her portfolio back up. "The southeast corner is even worse. There's a buckle near the window that catches everything." She said this the way someone passes along useful, practical information, not the way someone makes small talk with service staff to perform their own niceness. He looked at her. "You've noticed that?" She looked at him with a slight, tired smile. "I notice things." Then, "Are you okay with the rest of it? That cart looks heavy." "I've got it, thank you." She nodded and started back toward the conference room, then paused. "I'm going to be in that meeting for another 3 hours. Is there a place on this floor where a person can get decent coffee that isn't whatever's in the machine by the elevator?" "Supply Kitchen at the north end of 14 has a real machine," he said. "The creamer situation is uncertain, but the coffee itself is solid." She almost smiled. A real one this time, small and sideways, quickly controlled. "Good to know." Then she went back into the room. Nathan spent the rest of Wednesday paying attention. Her name was Victoria Hayes, and he learned this from the summit roster that was posted in the facilities coordinator's office. He'd glanced at it while dropping off a maintenance request form. She was the CEO of Halloran Logistics Solutions, a mid-size freight and warehousing company out of Columbus, Ohio, and she was attending the summit as part of Vail's ongoing evaluation of potential merger partners. He spent an hour that evening doing what he would have done in any due diligence situation, reading her company's publicly available reports, an interview she'd given 18 months ago to a trade publication about worker retention in logistics, a profile piece from a Columbus business journal that mentioned briefly that she'd built Halloran from a regional courier service with 11 employees into a regional powerhouse with 340 in 7 years, largely by investing in operational efficiency and an unusually low employee turnover rate. The interviewer had asked her what her management philosophy was. "I think most companies treat their frontline workers as a cost to be managed," she'd said. "I treat them as the people who actually do everything. There's a difference, and it shows up in your numbers eventually." Nathan had read that paragraph twice. Then he'd closed his laptop and sat in the parking garage of a building 2 blocks from his own headquarters, still wearing the gray uniform with Daniel Brooks stitched above the pocket. And he'd thought about Irene Moss's email and Marcus Webb's carefully worded report, and the 300 employees he passed every day in his own building who he wasn't sure he actually saw anymore. Thursday brought the summit's first joint presentation session, and Nathan positioned himself in the hallway with a reason to be there. A scuffed section of baseboard near the conference room doors that needed attention, a task that required unhurried proximity to the room. He saw Ryan Mercer for the first time. Ryan was 29, the kind of attractive that came with obvious awareness of itself, and he moved through rooms the way people move when they've learned that confidence reads as competence in professional environments where no one looks closely enough. He was from one of Vail's East Coast partner firms, was vocal about it in the way people are when they want to establish their value in a new room, and had already, Nathan had noted, managed to insert himself into 3 separate conversation clusters since the summit began, each time positioning himself as someone who synthesized other people's ideas into clear, confident statements. Victoria had been making points in the morning session about operational redundancy and driver scheduling inefficiency. Nathan had caught fragments of it through the door, and when the session broke for lunch, he overheard Ryan in the hallway describing these exact ideas to a senior Vail director as if he'd spent the week developing them. The driver scheduling angle is what I keep coming back to, Ryan was saying, easy and relaxed. You optimize that window and you're looking at a 12 to 15% cost reduction easily. I've been crunching the numbers. The Vail director nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need at the leadership level. Ryan smiled, happy to put together a full presentation. Victoria was 8 feet away, refilling her coffee from a shared carafe. And if she'd heard, and Nathan suspected she had, because she heard things, she gave no external indication. She just stirred her coffee and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, expression unreadable. Nathan went back to the baseboard. Thus, on Thursday afternoon, the supply cart's back wheel jammed again. A different seam, this time on floor 15, and Nathan was crouched down trying to work it free when he heard footsteps slow behind him. Is it the seam again? He looked up. Victoria Hayes, portfolio in hand, clearly between meetings. Different seam, he said. Same principle. She set her portfolio down and crouched across from him with no apparent concern for her blazer or her posture, or the fact that a CEO from Columbus shouldn't probably be kneeling on the floor of a Chicago office tower helping a janitor fix a supply cart. She examined the wheel with the practical focus of someone who had dealt with actual equipment problems and knew how they worked. Is there a locking mechanism that might be stuck? Here, he said, pointing. If you lift from that side, she lifted. He adjusted the wheel. The cart rolled free. They both stood. There was a brief, slightly strange moment of 2 people who had just done something together and weren't entirely sure what to do with that. You're good at practical problems, she said. Pays to be. She tilted her head, studying him with a directness that was neither rude nor particularly comfortable. You've been on this floor most of the week. East wing rotation, he said. The meetings are brutal, she said. Not like she was complaining exactly. More like she was simply naming something accurately. Have you ever been in one where you can tell exactly who's going to be listened to before anyone said a word? Nathan looked at her steadily. Every day of my life, he said. Something in her expression shifted slightly. She nodded once, picked up her portfolio, and then said almost as an afterthought, Have you eaten lunch? He paused. Not yet. The break room on this floor has sandwiches today. Real ones, not the plastic-wrapped ones. She said this with the same matter-of-factness she used for everything else, then walked away before he could respond. Friday morning arrived with the kind of steel-gray Chicago sky that made the city feel like it was bracing for something, and Nathan showed up at the service entrance at 6:10, 20 minutes early, which made Ernesto Guzman look at him with the mildly suspicious approval of a supervisor who expected new people to be late and had never quite adjusted his expectations when they weren't. The networking gala was that evening. A formal dinner and reception for all summit participants and select Vail senior leadership in the tower's 42nd floor event space. Nathan had known about it from the beginning. He'd arranged his undercover schedule around it deliberately. He wanted to see how his senior leadership behaved in a social environment where the professional performance relaxed slightly and the underlying attitudes showed through. He was not supposed to be working the event. His rotation was days. But he'd asked Ernesto on Thursday afternoon if there was anyone short-staffed for the evening event setup, framed it as being willing to pick up extra hours. And Ernesto, who was perpetually short-staffed for evening events because the pay rate for after hours was fine, but the hours themselves were rough, had said yes. So Nathan put on a fresh gray uniform that evening and took the service elevator to 42. The 42nd floor looked the way corporate event spaces always looked. Carefully lit, aggressively tasteful, designed to signal success without any single element being too specific about what kind of success or for whom. Round tables with linen cloths, floral arrangements that cost more than what the catering staff were being paid for the night. An open bar along the east wall where a bartender was already building a row of wine glasses with the quiet efficiency of someone who did this 5 nights a week. Nathan's job was to manage the tables along the perimeter and keep the service station stocked. He stationed himself near the east corridor and waited for the room to fill. The summit participants arrived in clusters, the way people always did at these things. Small groups that had formed over the week, professional alliances built through shared suffering in conference rooms. Victoria arrived alone, just past 7, wearing a dark blazer over a simple black dress that managed to look both professional and like she hadn't tried too hard. She stood near the entrance for a moment, scanning the room with the slightly tired assessment of someone attending an event they felt obligated to attend. Ryan Mercer appeared at her side almost immediately. Victoria. He said her name the way people say names when they've practiced the casualness of it. You look incredible. Thank you, she said, without warmth, but also without hostility. I've been meaning to catch you. I know the scheduling presentation this week kind of built on some of your initial observations, and I wanted to make sure I acknowledged that to the leadership team properly. Nathan, 10 feet away, watched Victoria's face. She was very controlled, but he'd spent a week learning her expressions, the small tells, the fractional tightening around her eyes, the barely there pause before she responded that meant she was choosing between several things she could say. That's generous of you, she said finally. Ryan smiled, and Nathan noticed that the smile reached all the right muscles in his face. It was a practice smile, the kind that had probably gotten Ryan a lot of things in his life. I was thinking we could grab coffee next week, actually. Talk about a potential collaboration? Before Victoria could answer, a cluster of Vail senior directors arrived in their vicinity, and Ryan pivoted seamlessly toward them, drawing Victoria in with a hand at her elbow that she subtly shifted away from. Within 60 seconds, he was in the center of the group, talking, gesturing, commanding, and Victoria was on the outside edge of the circle. Nathan watched her take one quiet step back from the group, glass of wine in hand, and look at the city out the window. He's not sure later exactly when the evening shifted. It happened the way things happen at events like this. Gradually, then suddenly. The alcohol volume in the room rose imperceptibly. Voices got louder. The careful professional performances that people had been maintaining all week began to loosen slightly at the edges, the way costumes do when people forget they're wearing them. Ryan's crowd had been getting increasingly boisterous near the bar. Nathan had positioned himself across the room near a service station, watching without appearing to watch. He saw the moment Ryan turned and noticed him. There was a beat, just a fraction of a second, where something passed across Ryan's expression. Something that might have been discomfort or recognition, or the calculation of someone deciding how to perform in front of an audience. Hey, Ryan said, raising his voice just enough to carry. He was talking to Nathan, but angled toward the group. Can we get some more of the sparkling water over here? The service staff seems a little stretched. Nathan looked at him, said nothing, moved toward the service station to address the request. Actually, Ryan continued, still performing, while you're at it, is there a reason the tables on this side have been sitting empty for the last 20 minutes? Is that not part of the evening's setup? Several people in the group were watching now, not with hostility exactly, more with the passive attention of people who found this kind of thing mildly entertaining without quite being willing to admit it. I'll see to it, Nathan said quietly. I mean, that's sort of the job, right? Ryan's voice had that particular quality. Light, almost jovial, technically not quite rude enough to be called rude, but constructed in a way that established very clearly the distance between him and you. Not exactly a complicated operation. One of the Vail directors laughed, short and uncomfortable. And then something happened that Nathan didn't see coming. From across the room, clearly, and without particular volume but with absolute certainty, Victoria Hayes said, Ryan. Just the name, nothing else. But the way she said it. Ryan turned. Can I get your thoughts on the quarterly numbers I mentioned this morning? Her tone was professional and completely neutral, but she had crossed the room while she spoke and was now inserting herself into the space between Ryan and Nathan with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I think the group would actually find it interesting. Ryan blinked. Sure, of course. Great. She turned toward the Vail directors. Ryan had some thoughts on Q3 freight efficiency that built on my scheduling analysis. I'd love to hear how he sees the integration between our two approaches. It was surgical. She had done it without raising her voice, without making a scene, without even technically calling Ryan out. But she'd redirected the entire conversation, reestablished the origins of the ideas in question, and put Ryan in the position of either confirming her version of events or contradicting himself in front of senior leadership. Nathan watched Ryan process all of this in the space of about 3 seconds. "Right," Ryan said, slightly less at ease than he'd been a moment ago. "So the scheduling model Victoria developed?" And then the glass broke. Not Ryan's. Someone at the bar, reaching past someone else, caught the stem of a wine glass at the wrong angle. It shattered on the marble floor in a way that sent glass in a wide, sparkling scatter across maybe 6 feet of floor space, and the group near the bar took an instinctive step back, and someone said, "Oh God," and the bartender moved toward the back for something to clean it up with. Victoria had been standing at the edge of that radius. She looked down at the glass around her feet with the calm assessment of someone determining what to do, and then she simply crouched down and began gathering the larger pieces. "You don't have to," the bartender started. "It's fine," she said. "Just don't." Nathan was already moving. He grabbed a clean cloth from the service station, got to her in 4 seconds, and knelt beside her. He was focused on the glass. There was a particularly large, sharp piece near her hand, and he reached for it, and she reached for it at the same moment, and the shard caught the inside edge of her right palm. She inhaled sharply, but didn't make a sound. "I've got it," Nathan said immediately. He wrapped the cloth around her hand, applying pressure. He could feel her hand trembling slightly, or maybe that was his hands. He'd pressed his palm over hers through the cloth and was holding it firm, and he was looking at her and she was looking at him, and for exactly 3 seconds neither of them said anything. Then the HR director, Pamela Reese, arrived. Pamela Reese was 51, deeply protective of the company's image, and had a gift for appearing at moments of interpersonal friction with the energy of someone trying to prevent a photograph from being taken. She materialized out of the crowd with the slightly breathless authority of a person who had decided that something was about to become a problem. "I think we need to get this area cleared quickly," she said, looking primarily at Victoria. "We don't want this to become a whole thing." Victoria looked up at her, hand still wrapped in the cloth. "Someone dropped a glass." "Of course, yes, that happens. But I think we need to be careful about the atmosphere here. This is a professional event, and we don't want—" "A woman cut her hand," Nathan said. His voice came out differently than it had all week. Quieter, but with a quality to it that made Pamela Reese pause and look at him the way you look at someone when they've said something that doesn't quite match who you thought you were talking to. "The maintenance team will handle the cleanup," Pamela said, recovering. "And perhaps, She looked at Victoria. "We can find you somewhere quiet to sit down." "I'm fine," Victoria said. She took the cloth from Nathan's hand, stood up, and looked at her palm. The cut was not deep, but it needed attention. She looked at Nathan. "Thank you." Then she walked toward the restrooms with the same upright, controlled posture she'd walked out of the conference room with on Wednesday morning. Pamela turned to Nathan. "This area needs to be cleared immediately, please." "Yes," Nathan said. He started clearing the glass, working carefully with a dustpan and a handheld brush, and he listened to Pamela Reese spend the next 4 minutes explaining to 2 senior Vail directors that the situation had been handled properly and that certain attendees sometimes don't fully understand the professional norms of these environments. He didn't look up, but he heard every word. He stayed late that night, long after the event broke up, long after the catering staff finished the breakdown. Nathan sat in a small records room off the 15th floor that he'd identified early in the week as a space that building security did not check between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. He had his personal laptop, a VPN router, and his own credentials, which, of course, had full access to every corner of Vail Dynamics' internal systems. He spent 3 hours reading the HR complaint database, internal email archives, performance review files, promotion records, exit interview documentation going back 4 years. What he found was not dramatic. It was not a single conspiracy or a clear villain. It was something worse, a pattern. Steady, quiet, mundane, and almost entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. Complaints from frontline and facility staff that had been received, acknowledged with a template response, and then routed into a review process that produced no documented outcome. 6 formal grievances about the conduct of specific senior managers that had been classified as interpersonal conflicts and placed in files that no one had opened in 2 years. A pattern in the promotion records that showed clearly, once you were looking at it, that team leaders who prioritized worker satisfaction metrics were consistently passed over in favor of those whose departments showed higher short-term output, regardless of turnover rate. An email thread between 3 directors from 11 months ago discussing how to handle the increasing number of morale-related complaints coming from the summit support staff. One of the directors had written, "Honestly, at this point, I think the simplest move is to adjust the process for how these get logged. If the threshold for a formal review is higher, we see fewer formal reviews. Perception problem largely solved." No one had replied to push back on this. And now, in a file that had been started just this week, there was a preliminary note, not a formal complaint, not yet, but a note, about Victoria Hayes. It had been added by Pamela Reese. It described Victoria's behavior at the summit as occasionally disruptive to group cohesion, and noted that she had demonstrated an adversarial orientation toward established leadership perspectives. Nathan read the note twice. He thought about the conference room on Wednesday morning, the angle of Victoria's jaw when she'd walked out. He thought about Ryan describing her ideas as his own to a senior director in a hallway. He thought about tonight, her stepping into the space between Ryan's performance and his maintenance uniform, quiet and exact, without making it about herself. He thought about her crouched on the marble floor gathering glass shards in a blazer, not because she'd been asked to and not to make a point, but just because there was glass on the floor and someone needed to deal with it. He thought about Pamela Reese telling 2 directors that Victoria didn't understand professional norms. He closed the laptop, sat in the quiet of the records room for a while, and felt something settling in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, and was most accurately described as the specific, clarifying weight of knowing what you have to do. He had come here to see his company clearly. He had seen it. Now he had to decide what kind of man he was going to be when he walked back in the front door. He left the building at 1:15 in the morning through the service entrance, stepping out into the cold Chicago air with his duffel bag over one shoulder. The city was doing its late-night thing. Distant sirens, a cab hissing through slush on Wacker, the deep blue-black of the sky above the lit towers. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air, feeling the weight of the week press down on him. The gray uniform, the mop bucket, the faces of people who had looked through him for 5 days. Patrice, the cleaning staff member who'd been spoken to like she was inconveniently present. Ernesto, who managed a team of people who kept the building functioning and was treated by the building management like a scheduling problem. The exit interviews of 37 people who had left the company in the past 2 years, most of whom had cited leadership culture in language that was polite enough to be dismissible. And Victoria Hayes, crouched on a marble floor gathering broken glass, looking up at him through the noise of a room full of people who had decided she didn't belong there. His phone buzzed, a text from his mother. "Lily asked for you before bed, told her you were working. She said, he always is. She's fine. Just FYI." Nathan stared at the message for a long moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket, adjusted the strap of the bag, and walked toward the parking structure. Tomorrow morning, the name on the badge was going to change. He didn't sleep when he got home. He tried. He went through the motions of it, showered, changed, lay down in the dark. But his mind kept moving through what he'd seen in those HR files, the way his hands kept moving through a problem in a boardroom, methodically, without rest, turning each piece over to find its edges. The email about adjusting the complaint threshold. Pamela Reese's note about Victoria. The 37 exit interviews sitting in a folder that no one had opened. At 3 in the morning, he gave up, went downstairs, and made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, looking out at the backyard where Lily's swing set was just visible in the dark, the swings moving slightly in the wind off the lake. His wife, Claire, had picked that swing set out. She'd spent 45 minutes in the store debating between 2 nearly identical models and had ultimately chosen the one that was slightly more expensive because the chains were thicker. The cheap ones rust faster, she'd said, with the practical certainty she brought to most things. And I want it to last. It had lasted. Claire hadn't. He poured the coffee, drank it standing up, and by 4:30 he was at his desk with 3 windows open on his laptop. The HR files, the summit roster, and a blank document where he was building a list that was not yet a plan but was becoming one. By the time Lily came downstairs at 7, trailing her blanket and asking if there were waffles, Nathan had the shape of what needed to happen. He just didn't have all the pieces yet. "There can be waffles," he said, closing the laptop. "Can I put the syrup on myself?" "Within reason." She considered this seriously. "What's the reason?" "The reason is that last time you used approximately a cup of syrup on 2 waffles. They were dry." "Lily." "Fine," she said, climbing onto the bar stool. "Within reason." He made the waffles. He watched her eat with the particular focused intensity she brought to food she liked. And he thought about how 7 years had happened without him entirely noticing, and how she'd said he always is when his mother told her he was working, and how that sentence had weight in it that he wasn't ready to examine too closely yet. He kissed the top of her head when she finished eating. She smelled like sleep and maple syrup. "I'll be home for dinner," he said. "You said that yesterday." "And I was." She looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone extending conditional trust. He drove himself to work for the first time in 4 years. The parking garage attendant did not recognize him. Nathan hadn't expected him to. They'd never spoken, and Nathan had always arrived via car service to the executive entrance. He paid the daily rate in cash, took a ticket from the machine, and walked through the garage toward the building's main entrance with his hands in his coat pockets, feeling the strange, layered disorientation of re-entering a space as himself after inhabiting it as someone else. The lobby security guard checked his badge, his real one now. The guard glanced at the name, glanced at his face, and then did the slow double take of someone whose brain is processing something that doesn't immediately compute. "Mr. Cole, morning," Nathan said, and kept walking toward the executive elevators. He had calls to make before the summit's morning session started at 9. The first call was to Dana, his assistant, who answered on the second ring with the professionally calm energy of someone who had spent 5 years being unflappable. "Good morning. Are you in the building? 42nd floor in 20 minutes, he said. "I need the boardroom, not the executive suite. And I need you to pull the full employment and HR records for the past 3 years. Complaints, resolutions, promotion logs, exit interviews, all of it. And have them ready before 10. A brief pause. "All of it?" "All of it." Yes. "Okay. Should I reach out to Marcus Webb?" "Not yet." Another pause, shorter this time. Dana had a gift for reading the temperature of a situation through very limited information. "Okay," she said. 20 minutes. The second call was to the head of building security, a former police detective named Gerald Okafor, who picked up immediately. "Mr. Cole, I've been trying to reach... I know, I'm back in the building. I need you to pull footage from the 42nd floor event space, last night, approximately 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. And I need the footage from the 14th floor summit conference rooms, all of this week. Can you have that compiled by noon?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I can have it by 10:30. "Good." "Sir, the things that have been happening this week with the summit..." "I know," Nathan said. "That's what the footage is for." He ended the call, stepping out of the elevator onto 42, which was being set up for a breakfast reception he'd known nothing about until reading the summit schedule at 3 in the morning. The catering staff was arranging pastry trays and repositioning chairs. One of them, a young man he didn't know, glanced up when Nathan walked in, registered the suit, and returned to his work. Nathan stopped. "How long have you been setting up?" The young man looked up again, slightly uncertain. "Since 6:15, sir." "Is there coffee that isn't meant for the breakfast service?" The young man blinked, then said, "There's a pot in the back prep area. It's just the regular stuff, not the good..." "That's fine," Nathan said. "Thank you." He got the coffee himself from the back prep area, poured it into a plain paper cup, and brought it back out to drink while he stood at the east window and looked at the city waking up below him, 32 floors up. The lake was iron gray and choppy. The expressway was already thickening with the morning crawl. A barge was moving south along the river, slow and purposeful, carrying something Nathan couldn't identify from this height. He had maybe 3 hours before things started moving in directions that couldn't be stopped. He drank the coffee and thought about what order to do things in. The problem, and he had been sitting with this all night, was that this couldn't just be a cleaning operation. That was the easy version, the version where you fire the bad actors, issue a policy memo, schedule some mandatory trainings, and tell yourself the culture has been addressed. Nathan had seen that version play out in other companies. He'd read about it. He'd watched organizations do the performative version of change and then gradually drift back to exactly what they'd been before, because the structure that created the behavior had never actually been touched. The structure of what had happened this week: Ryan stealing credit, Pamela bearing complaints, the directors laughing in the hallway, the executive who stepped over the wet floor without breaking stride. That wasn't about individual bad apples. It was about a system that had quietly, over years, learned to reward a specific kind of person and ignore or eliminate everyone else. Nathan had built this company. He had not built that system intentionally, but he had let it grow in the spaces he wasn't watching, and that was on him in a way that he was not yet entirely ready to feel the full weight of, but was going to have to. He crumpled the empty paper cup, tossed it in the prep area bin, and went to find Dana. She had the records ready. Of course she did. He spent an hour with them, adding to what he'd already read the night before, cross-referencing names against the footage timeline Gerald had sent over by 10:15. The conference room footage was telling, not in a dramatic way. There was no single moment that would have read as obviously wrong to a casual observer. It was the accumulation of things. The way the meeting facilitator consistently moved on from Victoria mid-sentence to acknowledge a male speaker who'd started talking over her. The way Ryan had positioned himself at the presenter's end of the table every morning, regardless of who was scheduled to lead. The way the group energy shifted, perceptible only if you were watching for it. When Victoria made a point that landed, and then watched that point get quietly absorbed and re-expressed by someone else 3 minutes later as if the idea had just occurred to them. There was one moment from Wednesday afternoon that Nathan watched twice. Victoria had been explaining a routing optimization model, something about staggered dispatch windows that reduce driver idle time. And she was good at it, the way technically intelligent people are when they're talking about something they've thought about for real, with specificity and some confidence. Two of the Veil directors had been leaning forward, and then Ryan, from the far end of the table, had said, "Right, and I think what Victoria's getting at, if I can just build on that for a second," and proceeded to spend 4 minutes essentially rephrasing what she'd just said in slightly broader strokes, with 2 diagrams he'd pulled up on his laptop. At the end of Ryan's 4 minutes, one of the directors said, "That's a really useful framework." Victoria had looked at the table. Nathan had watched her face in that moment, the careful, practiced stillness of it, and felt something he recognized from years ago, from his own early career, before he'd had a name and resources and the weight of a successful company behind him. The feeling of knowing you're right and being in a room where being right is not, by itself, sufficient. He closed the footage windows and called Marcus Webb. Marcus arrived in the boardroom 11 minutes later looking the way Marcus always looked. Careful, professionally composed, with the slightly preemptive quality of a man who'd learned to walk into rooms braced for something. He was 44, good at his job in the transactional sense, and, Nathan was now certain, deeply conflict-averse in a way that had allowed the culture problem to compound quietly for years. "Nathan," he sat down across the table. "I didn't know you were... We hadn't heard you were coming back from... I was here all week," Nathan said. Marcus went very still. "Facilities rotation. East Wing, 12 through 15. Nathan kept his voice even. "I've spent this week reading every complaint file your department has processed in the past 3 years, watching how meetings are run in that summit program, and reviewing footage of your annual networking gala." He paused. "Walk me through your rationale for the complaint threshold adjustment." The color had drained from Marcus's face in a specific, patchy way that Nathan recognized as genuine shock. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The threshold adjustment was a structural decision to ensure that... "Marcus." Nathan's voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. "I've read the email chain. I know whose idea it was and who signed off on it and what the stated rationale was. I'm asking you, right now, face to face, to explain to me why you thought reducing the visibility of employee complaints was a solution to a culture problem, rather than a method of hiding one." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, and Nathan gave him some credit for not trying to spin it further, "I think I made the wrong call." "You did," Nathan said. "I need you to understand that what's going to happen now is going to be uncomfortable for some people in this building, and I need to know whether you are the person to help me do it or whether you're going to need to step aside. Marcus looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface. What does uncomfortable mean, exactly? It means a full audit of every complaint that was buried. It means a documented review of every promotion decision in the past 3 years against the actual performance data. It means Ryan Mercer is removed from the leadership program today, and it means Pamela Reese is suspended pending a review of that note she filed about Victoria Hayes. Marcus breathed out slowly. Pamela's going to do what the company requires of her, Nathan said. The question is whether you're going to help me execute this properly or not. There was another silence. Outside the boardroom's glass wall, Nathan could see the building moving through its morning. People with coffee cups and laptops, the elevator banks cycling, the particular rhythm of a company going about its day without knowing it was about to change. I'll help, Marcus said quietly. Good. I need the Mercer file on my desk by 2 o'clock. Marcus left. Nathan sat alone in the boardroom for a moment, looking at the city, and then checked his watch. The summit's morning session had started 40 minutes ago. He needed to be in that room. Not yet, but soon. He was still working through the sequencing of it when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Gerald from security, who apparently texted from a personal phone when something was urgent. Thought you should know. There's a situation developing in the summit session on Fortin. Ms. Hayes is presenting. Recommend you watch the live feed. Nathan pulled up the conference room feed on his laptop. Victoria was standing at the front of the room. She had a presentation on the screen behind her, her own, clearly, her name on the header slide, her data. And she was mid-sentence, talking about driver retention rates and their relationship to scheduling autonomy. Her voice was steady. She was good in front of a room, not polished in the performed sense, but clear and specific, the kind of speaker whose confidence came from actually knowing the material rather than from having rehearsed how to seem confident. Ryan was sitting at the far left of the table, and he was not looking at the presentation. He was looking at his phone. One of the Vail directors, a man named Harold Briggs, whom Nathan had reviewed in the personnel files and found consistently in the background of every decision that had prioritized short-term metrics over worker welfare, raised his hand. This is interesting, Victoria, but I want to push back a bit on the human capital framing. I think there's a risk of over-indexing on employee satisfaction when what the board is actually looking at is cost efficiency. Victoria paused. She'd been waiting for this, or something like it. Nathan could see it in the way she didn't blink. The data I'm presenting shows that in our Columbus and Dayton operations, the facilities where we implemented scheduling autonomy saw a 17% reduction in sick day usage and a 23% drop in annual turnover. At current replacement costs, that's approximately $800,000 in savings per facility per year. That's not a human capital argument. That's a cost efficiency argument. Briggs nodded in the way people nod when they've already decided not to be convinced. Sure. But that's your operation, your scale, your workforce demographics. We'd need to see how that translates to Vail's operational footprint before... I've modeled it, Victoria said. She advanced to the next slide. Based on Vail's last published workforce numbers and your publicly available turnover data, the conservative projection is $31 million in annual savings across your full fleet operations. The aggressive projection is closer to 45. The room was quiet. Ryan looked up from his phone. Briggs shifted in his seat. Where are you pulling the turnover data from? Your own HR quarterly reports. They're on your internal portal. I requested access through the Summit Administration Office on Monday. Another silence. Nathan, watching from the boardroom upstairs, felt something that might have been pride, and then noted that he had absolutely no claim to pride in Victoria Hayes' performance, given that he'd been pushing a mop cart while she was doing the actual work of being brilliant. Then Briggs said, I appreciate the analysis. I think we'll want to have the internal team review the methodology before we draw any conclusions. He looked around the table. Maybe Ryan, since you've been tracking the efficiency piece, you can take point on that review? Ryan nodded, and his face did the thing faces do when someone hands them an opportunity they hadn't anticipated, and they're processing it faster than their expression can hide. Sure. Happy to. Victoria stood very still at the front of the room. Nathan could not see her face at this angle. The camera was positioned behind her. but he could see the line of her shoulders, and he watched the breath she took. "I'm happy to work directly with whoever's leading the methodology review," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "The data set is mine, so I'll need to be part of that process." "Of course," Briggs said, already looking down at his phone. The session continued. Nathan closed the laptop, stood up, and walked out of the boardroom. He had one more thing to do before 2 o'clock. Ernesto Guzman was in the facilities coordinator's office on the building's lower level, working through a maintenance schedule on a clipboard that had seen better years. He looked up when Nathan appeared in the doorway, and his expression went through several stages quickly. Confusion, recognition dawning, something Nathan read as the beginning of wariness. "Mr. Cole," Ernesto said. He didn't stand, which Nathan respected. "Mr. Guzman." Nathan sat down in the chair across from him without being invited, because the alternative was standing over him, which wasn't a dynamic he wanted. "I want to thank you for the week." Ernesto set down the clipboard. He had the watchful stillness of a man who'd worked in the service industry long enough to know that conversations that started with gratitude from people who outranked you weren't always about gratitude. "You're welcome," he said carefully. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly, without worrying about what the right answer is supposed to be." Nathan looked at him. "What does it actually feel like to manage this team in this building?" Ernesto studied him for a moment. The wariness was still there, but behind it something else. The calculation of a person deciding whether honesty was worth the risk. "You want the real answer," Ernesto said. "I want the real answer." Ernesto leaned back in his chair. The chair squeaked. "It feels like managing people who are good at their jobs and who know they don't matter to anyone above the third floor." He said it without bitterness, just flatly, like someone reporting weather. "My team keeps this building running. We deal with the overflow from the bathrooms when plumbing backs up. We clean up after the parties on 42. We fix the things that break at 6 in the morning before any of the office staff get in. And most of the people in this building," he paused, choosing his words, "they don't see us. Not in a mean way necessarily, they just don't see us." "Irene Moss sent an email to HR 8 months ago," Nathan said. "Did you know about that?" "She told me she'd sent something." His jaw tightened slightly. "Nothing came of it." "I know." Nathan held his gaze. "I'm going to need your help putting together a real account of what's been happening, documented, named. I'm going to have someone from my office reach out to you this week, not HR, directly to me. I want you to tell them what you told me and everything else. Can you do that?" Ernesto was quiet. The wariness had shifted. Not to trust, exactly. That would take longer and would need to be earned, and Nathan knew it. But to something more tentative. The posture of someone deciding whether to open a door they'd kept closed for a long time. "What's going to happen with what I tell them?" he asked. "It's going to be part of a formal review that changes how this company operates. Whether the people involved face real consequences depends on what the review finds. But I can promise you it will not be buried, and it will not result in retaliation against you or anyone on your team." Ernesto looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "Patrice got spoken to like she was furniture last Tuesday, by a director named Whitfield." "Michael Whitfield," Nathan said. "I have it in the HR file." Nothing happened. "Something will happen now." Nathan stood. "Thank you, Mr. Guzman." He was at the door when Ernesto said, "Can I ask you something?" Nathan turned. "Why'd you do it yourself? The undercover thing?" He said it without accusation, just with the directness of someone who'd spent a career around people who made decisions and wanted to understand this one. "You could have hired investigators, consultants, whatever." Nathan thought about it. "Because consultants write reports about problems. I needed to understand what the problem actually felt like." Ernesto nodded slowly. "And do you?" Nathan thought about the mop bucket wheel squealing through the hallway, about the executive stepping into the wet floor without slowing down, about Patrice's face when she'd been spoken to like she was inconveniently present, about Victoria crouching on the marble floor, gathering glass. "Yeah," he said. "I do." He left Ernesto to his clipboard and took the elevator back up. The afternoon moved fast, the way afternoons move when you're making decisions that you can't unmake. Marcus delivered the Mercer file at 1:50. Nathan reviewed it in 20 minutes. It confirmed what the footage showed. With the additional information that Ryan had submitted a formal presentation proposal to the summit directors using language lifted almost verbatim from a document Victoria had shared with the group via email on Tuesday evening. The timestamp on Ryan's proposal was Wednesday morning. The timestamp on Victoria's email was Tuesday at 11:40 p.m. Nathan called Gerald at 2:30 and asked him to add specific footage to the package, the hallway conversation where Ryan had described Victoria's ideas to Harold Briggs over lunch, the timestamp on the presentation proposal, the conference room recording from Wednesday afternoon. Gerald had it compiled and on the shared drive by 3:15. At 4 o'clock, Nathan called Dana and told her to prepare the boardroom for 8 a.m. the following morning. Full board attendance, summit leadership, Ryan Mercer, Pamela Reese, and Victoria Hayes. Dana wrote this down without comment, then said, "Should I tell them what it's about?" "Tell them it's a leadership review," Nathan said. "That's accurate." He spent the next 2 hours preparing what he was going to say, which was less about preparation and more about clarity, getting the sequence right, being sure of the distinction between what he knew and what he could prove and what he was going to do about both. He'd been in enough rooms where truth got tangled in how it was delivered. He didn't want that. He wanted clean and cold and undeniable. At 6:15, he put the laptop in his bag, turned off the boardroom lights, and took the elevator down to the lobby. He was thinking about the drive home, about dinner, about Lily's conditional trust extended that morning, when he almost walked past the figure sitting on the low bench near the main entrance, the one that was technically for lobby guests, but in practice was just a place where people sat when they were tired and didn't have anywhere else to be for a moment. Victoria Hayes was sitting on it, coat on, bag on the floor beside her feet, elbows on her knees. She was looking at her right hand, which was wrapped in a neat bandage from presumably a first aid kit somewhere in the building. Her expression was the one he'd seen on Wednesday morning when she'd walked out of the conference room, controlled, but with effort, like someone managing something that took real work to manage. She looked up when he stopped, and her expression changed in that particular way it did when you recognize someone without quite having expected to see them. "Daniel," she said, and then immediately something flickered in her face. Uncertainty, maybe, or the slight strangeness of using a name with someone whose face was suddenly in a different context. Nathan hesitated. The badge was gone. He was in his regular clothes, the suit he'd changed into that morning, which was nothing like the gray uniform she'd seen him in all week. He looked, he knew, like a completely different person, because he was. "Victoria," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the suit, at the absence of the badge, and her expression did a careful, controlled adjustment. "You're not," she started. "No," he said, "I'm not." A short silence. She looked back at her bandaged hand, then back up at him. "Are you going to tell me what you actually are, or is this where you just leave the building and I never find out?" Nathan looked at the lobby around them. The evening security guard at the desk, the revolving doors with the last of the day's foot traffic moving through them, the brushed steel letters of Veil Dynamics on the floor. "I work here," he said, which was honest and also insufficient, and he knew it. She read his face the way she'd been reading situations all week, quickly, accurately, without giving away what she concluded. "Okay," she said finally. She stood, picked up her bag, and settled it on her shoulder. "That's interesting." Her voice was neutral in the specific way voices are when someone is processing more than they're showing. "How's your hand?" he asked. 7 stitches, she said. "The urgent care place on Michigan Avenue does good work, apparently." "I'm sorry. It wasn't your fault." She looked at him sideways. "Unless it was somehow, which I'm starting to think might be a possibility I should consider. It wasn't. Okay?" She looked at the revolving doors. "I have a 6 a.m. flight to Columbus in the morning. I was going to walk to the hotel, but I misjudged how cold it is, and I'm rethinking that. I can—" he started, and then stopped, because he hadn't actually thought about what he was going to offer, and the sentence had started before the thought was fully formed. "The hotel," he said. "I can get you a car." She looked at him with the sideways expression that he'd come to understand meant she was seeing something she wasn't going to say out loud. "You can get me a car," she repeated flatly, like someone testing the weight of a sentence. "Yes, a janitor who works in the east wing of floors 12 through 15, she said, "can get me a car." Nathan met her eyes. I owe you an explanation, he said. I know that. There's a meeting tomorrow morning at 8 that you need to be at. I'll make sure you're notified tonight. After that, I'll explain everything. She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her doing it, reading the situation, reading him, deciding how much to extend the benefit of the doubt to someone who had been operating under a false identity for the past 5 days in a building she'd been invited into as a professional. The meeting tomorrow, she said slowly. Is it related to whatever you've been doing this week? Yes. Is it going to be bad? He thought about Ryan, about Pamela's note, about Briggs suggesting that Ryan review Victoria's methodology. For some people, he said, not for you. She was quiet for a moment. The revolving doors turned. Someone in a heavy coat walked through with a briefcase. The security guard answered his phone. Okay, she said finally. I'll be at the meeting. She shifted her bag on her shoulder and started toward the revolving doors, then paused and looked back at him with the expression he'd first seen in the hallway on Wednesday, tired and precise and not particularly interested in softening things. For what it's worth, she said, Daniel was decent company. Then she pushed through the revolving door and was gone into the cold Chicago evening. Nathan stood in the lobby for a moment, looking at the door. Then he called his driver, sent a car to the Marriott on Michigan, and walked to his own car in the parking garage. He drove home with the windows up and the radio off, thinking about what he'd set in motion. The meeting was scheduled, the footage was compiled, the files were ready. Ryan Mercer didn't know yet that tomorrow was the last day of something. Pamela Reese didn't know. Harold Briggs didn't know. And Victoria Hayes was in a car to her hotel, with 7 stitches in her right hand and a boarding pass for a 6 a.m. flight, having just had a conversation with someone who had lied to her for 5 days and who she had apparently decided to give the benefit of the doubt for approximately 12 more hours. He owed her more than an explanation. He understood that. He pulled into his driveway at 7:10. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, he could see his mother moving around, and the smaller shape of Lily at the island, probably doing homework. He sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine, in the quiet of the garage, and let himself feel the weight of the week. Not the professional weight, not the strategic weight, but the other kind. The kind that came from having walked through his own company for 5 days in a stranger's name, and found it wanting in ways that were going to take a long time to fix. The kind that came from watching a woman spend a week being brilliant in a room that refused to see it, and knowing he'd been close enough to see it clearly and had done nothing until last night. The kind that came from his daughter's voice saying he always is, and understanding that the sentence had weight because it was true. He got out of the car and went inside. Lily heard the door and came running from the kitchen, which she hadn't done in a while. She crashed into him at knee height, arms around his legs. You're home, she said, like she was confirming it to herself. I'm home, he said. He put his hand on the top of her head. She smelled like shampoo and crayons and the specific scent of a small person who had been doing something creative and absorbing all afternoon. Grandma made soup, she said into his coat. Yeah? It has too many vegetables. I'll mention it. She let go of his legs and looked up at him with her mother's serious eyes. Are you okay, Papa? He looked at her, 7 years old, and she could read a room the same way Claire had been able to, quietly, without making a production of it, just noticing. Yeah, Bug, he said. I'm okay. She studied him for another second and then apparently decided to accept this. Come see what I drew, she said, and ran back toward the kitchen. He followed her. The soup smelled like garlic and thyme and too many vegetables, and the kitchen was warm, and Lily spread her drawing across the island with the particular pride of someone presenting important work. It was a picture of a building, blocky, drawn in crayon, with a lot of windows, and in front of it 2 small figures, one taller, one shorter. The taller one had a briefcase. The shorter one had what appeared to be a cape, though Lily sometimes gave herself a cape in drawings without particular narrative justification. Who's this? Nathan asked, pointing to the taller figure. That's you, she said, going to work. And this one? That's me, she said, coming with you someday. He looked at the drawing for a moment. Someday soon, he said. She beamed, capped her red crayon, and climbed onto the bar stool to have her 2-vegetable soup. Nathan hung up his coat and sat down beside her, and the evening came in around them, ordinary and warm, and for the first time in a while, enough. Tomorrow would be what it needed to be. Tonight, there was soup. The notification reached Victoria's phone at 9:47 p.m., while she was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with her shoes still on, looking at nothing in particular. It was a calendar invite from Vail Dynamics Executive Scheduling System. Subject line, Leadership and Summit Review Meeting. Mandatory attendance. Time, 8 a.m. Location, Boardroom, Floor 42. Her name was in the attendee list alongside the summit directors, senior Vail leadership, and two names she didn't recognize from the board roster. Ryan Mercer's name was also on it. She stared at the invite for a long moment, then accepted it, set her phone face down on the bedside table, and lay back on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Her right hand throbbed under the bandage with the steady, particular insistence of a recent wound. Not sharp anymore, just present, a reminder. 7 stitches. The urgent care doctor had been efficient and not particularly gentle, which she'd appreciated. She didn't like people being careful with her when careful meant slow. She thought about the lobby, about the man in the suit where the gray uniform had been. She'd known something was off about him since Wednesday, not in a threatening way, more in the way you know when a room's furniture has been rearranged slightly and you can't immediately identify which piece moved, just that the proportions are wrong. The way he talked wasn't quite right for the job, too measured. The specific quality of his attention when he was listening, not servile, not distracted, but the focused, assessing stillness of someone who was used to processing information quickly and deciding what mattered. She'd noticed it and filed it in the part of her brain that cataloged things she didn't yet have enough information to explain. And then tonight, the suit. The way the security guard had straightened almost imperceptibly when he walked past. The ease with which he'd said, "I can get you a car." Not like someone offering a favor, but like someone for whom this was a completely ordinary thing to arrange. "I work here," he'd said. "Sure," she'd thought. "You work here." She turned onto her side and looked at the city lights through the gap in the curtains. Columbus was smaller and quieter, and she slept better there. But Chicago had a particular nighttime energy that she'd always found interesting, the sense of a very large machine still running at partial capacity, unwilling to fully stop. She thought about the meeting invite. Mandatory attendance. She thought about what he'd said. For some people. Not for you. She should have asked more questions. She'd chosen not to, partly because she was tired and her hand hurt, and she'd been managing her emotions for 6 days in a room full of people who treated managing emotions as a professional weakness, and she was done performing for the night. And partly, and this was the part she was less comfortable examining, because she'd believed him. The not for you part. She'd looked at his face when he said it, and she'd believed him. And that was a strange thing to do with someone who had been lying about who he was for 5 days. She closed her eyes. Her phone buzzed. A text from her operations director back in Columbus. "Driver schedule for next quarter is ready for your review whenever. No rush." Followed immediately by, "Actually, there might be a small rush. Hendricks is asking questions again." Followed by a grimacing emoji. She typed back, "I'll look at it tomorrow afternoon. Tell Hendricks the answer is still no." Then she put the phone back down. She thought about the $31 million projection she'd put on the screen that afternoon, and Harold Briggs nodding in the way people nodded when they'd already decided not to be convinced. She thought about Ryan saying happy to take point on the review with that particular ease. She thought about building a company from 11 people to 340, and still walking into rooms where the first thing people tried to establish was whether she belonged there. She was tired of it, not in the way that meant she was going to stop. She'd stopped being capable of stopping a long time ago, if she'd ever been capable of it at all. Tired in the way you're tired when something has been going on for so long that the energy it takes to keep going has become just part of the baseline, the way chronic pain becomes its own kind of normal. She lay there for a while, not sleeping, and eventually the city outside dimmed slightly and the throbbing in her hand settled into something manageable, and she drifted into the shallow, restless approximation of sleep that had been her pattern since her early 20s, when she'd first started running on too little and demanding too much of herself and never quite found the reset point. The alarm went off at 5:15. She was already mostly awake. She sat up, looked at her bandaged hand, flexed her fingers experimentally, stiff, uncomfortable, functional, and started getting ready for a meeting she still didn't fully understand but had decided, somewhere around 2 in the morning, to treat as an opportunity rather than an ambush. Those were usually the same thing anyway. It was mostly about framing, She was in the lobby of the hotel at 7:20, with her portfolio, her laptop, and a coffee she'd made in the room because the hotel restaurant didn't open until 8, and she wasn't willing to wait. The coffee was not good. She drank it anyway. The car service arrived at 7:25. A black sedan. Prompt. No driver she recognized. She noticed it was a Vail Dynamics account car. She noticed this because the booking confirmation that came to her phone listed the account name, and because she noticed things, and because this particular thing was interesting. She didn't say anything about it. She got in and watched Chicago scroll past the window in the early morning light. The Vail Dynamics lobby was different at 7:40 than it was at 9 a.m. Quieter, the security desk staffed by a different guard than she'd seen all week. The lobby floor empty enough that the brushed steel letters were clearly visible. She thought, for no particular reason, about the gray uniformed man who had known about the coffee machine in the supply kitchen on the north end of 14. She took the elevator to 42. The boardroom was already set up. Water on the table, a conference phone in the center, chairs for 12 people. 4 of those chairs were occupied when she arrived. 2 people she didn't recognize who had the look of board-level executives, and Dana, Nathan's assistant, who Victoria had interacted with once during the summit intake process, and who now gave her a brief professional nod and gestured toward the left side of the table. "Ms. Hayes, Mr. Cole asked that you sit here." Victoria sat. She put her portfolio on the table and her coffee cup, now empty, on the credenza behind her. She looked at the chair across the table where Dana had placed a plain name card that read, R. Mercer. She looked at this for a moment. Then she looked at the door. People arrived in the next 15 minutes with the particular energy of people who don't know what they're walking into but have been told it's mandatory, which produced a specific cocktail of professional composure and poorly concealed anxiety. Harold Briggs came in at 7:50 with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to chair something. 2 other summit directors followed. Pamela Reese arrived at 7:53, looking like she'd spent the morning deciding which version of prepared to be and had settled on aggressive. Ryan walked in at 7:58. He saw Victoria, and his expression did something complicated, a micro-adjustment, quickly smoothed, the face of someone running rapid calculations. He chose the seat across from her, picked up the name card, looked at it briefly, set it aside, and sat down. He glanced at her hand. "How's the injury?" "Fine," she said. "Good." He straightened his jacket. "Any idea what this is about?" "Leadership review?" she said. "That's what the invite said." He nodded slowly, and she watched him decide that he wasn't going to get anything useful from her and redirect his attention to his phone. The boardroom was full by 8:02. At 8:03, Nathan Cole walked in. He walked in the way people walk into rooms when they own them, not with performance, not with the theatrical confidence of someone who needed the room to feel it, but with the quiet, matter-of-fact authority of someone for whom ownership was just a fact about the room rather than something that needed demonstrating. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, and he had the slightly worn-around-the-edges look of someone who hadn't slept enough but had decided that was irrelevant. He put a laptop on the table and remained standing. The room had gone very quiet. Victoria watched Ryan Mercer's face in the moment that Nathan put the laptop on the table, and she watched it do the thing she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The recognition. The recalibration of every interaction from the past week against a completely different understanding of who the other person was. She could almost see it moving through him. The hallway. The service cart. The gala. The maintenance staff seems a little stretched. The way certain words sounded different when you understood who had heard them. Ryan's face didn't collapse exactly, but something in it went carefully, precisely blank in the way faces go blank when someone is buying time. Nathan looked around the table without particular expression. His gaze moved past Ryan, past Pamela Reese, past Harold Briggs, and settled briefly on Victoria, just long enough to be an acknowledgement, before returning to the center of the room. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "I'm going to keep this direct because I think we've spent enough time in this company being indirect about things." He opened the laptop. The screen on the boardroom wall came to life. What followed was 40 minutes of the most uncomfortable professional silence Victoria had ever sat inside. Nathan walked through it methodically, not with visible anger, not with drama, but with the particular cold clarity of someone who had prepared this very carefully and was not going to allow emotion to make it imprecise. The complaint files, the threshold adjustment email, The promotion patterns, visualized in a simple chart that made the trend unmistakable. The conference room footage, with timestamps. The hallway footage of Ryan describing Victoria's scheduling ideas to Harold Briggs at lunch, 6 hours before Ryan submitted a proposal using that same language. The timestamp on Victoria's email. The timestamp on Ryan's proposal. Pamela Reese's note about Victoria's adversarial orientation toward established leadership perspectives, filed the morning after the gala. 1. He showed each piece without editorializing. He let the documentation do it. The room was silent for most of it, in the specific way rooms are silent when everyone present understands that the silence is the appropriate response, and that anything said would only make it worse for the person who said it. Ryan sat very still through the footage of the hallway conversation. His face had settled into a controlled blankness that was, Victoria thought, probably the most authentic thing she'd seen from him all week. The face underneath the performance, which turned out to be not much of a face at all. Just stillness and calculation. Pamela Reese opened her mouth twice during Nathan's presentation. Both times she closed it again without speaking. The second time, Harold Briggs glanced at her with an expression that made clear he'd decided, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, that he was not going to be associated with whatever Pamela was about to say. When Nathan finished, he closed the laptop. "Ryan," he said, "you're removed from the Summit Leadership Program, effective this morning. Dana will process the paperwork." He looked at Ryan directly, and Ryan looked back at him with the very specific expression of someone who has been caught so completely and cleanly that there's nothing left to do but accept the geometry of it. If you have professional ambitions that are built on your actual work rather than other people's, I'd suggest starting there. Ryan said nothing. His jaw worked once, slightly. "Pamela," Nathan's voice stayed even. "You're suspended pending a full HR review. The scope of that review includes the complaint threshold adjustment and every file that was closed without resolution in the past 3 years. Marcus Webb will manage the process under external oversight." He paused. "I want to be clear that the purpose of the review is not punitive. It's to understand what was allowed to grow in this organization and make sure it can't grow back." Pamela Reese had gone the color of old paper. She opened her mouth, and this time something came out. "I was managing the company's exposure. You were managing the company's discomfort," Nathan said. "Those aren't the same thing." Pamela closed her mouth. He looked at Harold Briggs then, and something passed across Briggs's face. The awareness of a man who had been in the background of enough of this to be adjacent to it without being the direct target, which was, Nathan's expression suggested, not the safe position Briggs might have hoped it was. "Harold, the methodology review on the scheduling analysis goes to Victoria directly. Not through anyone else, her team, her data, her process." Briggs nodded, quickly, without argument. The confidence he'd walked in with had relocated itself somewhere out of the room. Nathan looked around the table one more time. This company has been running on a culture that rewarded the performance of competence over actual competence, and that treated the people who do the real operational work of this organization as invisible. That ends now. The audit process, the HR restructuring, and the new operational framework will be communicated to all staff by end of week. If anyone in this room has questions about how that affects their role, my office will schedule time. He looked at his watch. "We're done." People began to move, the way people move at the end of a meeting where something significant has happened, with a kind of subdued, slightly dazed efficiency, gathering their things and not quite making eye contact with each other. Ryan stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, folded it over his arm, and walked toward the door without looking at anyone. At the door he paused, and Victoria thought for a moment he was going to turn and say something. She wasn't sure what she expected, some form of justification or deflection, the version of events that made him the protagonist, but he didn't. He walked out. Pamela Reese left without speaking. Harold Briggs left without speaking. The two board members had a brief, quiet conversation with Nathan that Victoria couldn't hear from where she sat, and then they left too. And then it was Nathan and Victoria and Dana on her way out the door with her notebook and her professional unflappability intact. Victoria sat at the table with her portfolio in front of her and her bandaged hand flat on the surface and looked at Nathan Cole, who had spent 5 days pushing a mop cart through the hallways of his own building, and waited for him to explain himself. He sat down, not at the head of the table, in the chair 2 down from her, at roughly the same level, which she noted. "Your name isn't Daniel Brooks," she said. "No." You're the CEO. Yes. She breathed out through her nose. How long have you been planning the undercover thing? I started planning it about 6 weeks ago. I spent 2 weeks setting up the logistics. He said this without the defensiveness she'd half expected, just plainly. I received a complaint from a member of the facilities staff 8 months ago that described serious problems with how this company treats its workers. HR reviewed it and produced a report that said nothing. I needed to understand the problem from the inside. Why not hire investigators? I wanted to know what it felt like, he said. Not just what it looked like on paper. She thought about the supply cart wheel and the carpet seam and the way he'd wrapped his hand over hers through the cloth with the focused, almost involuntary care of someone who was past thinking about what they were doing. You have good cover for a billionaire, she said. The mop technique was convincing. Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the compression of one. I grew up in Bridgeport, he said. My father was a maintenance supervisor. I spent summers working for him. She absorbed this. And the week? Did you get what you needed? He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the pause. The same kind she used when she was choosing between the professional answer and the true one. I got more than I needed, he said finally. I got a very clear understanding of what I'd been allowing to happen inside my own building while I was on the 48th floor, not paying attention. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without deflecting, which she respected. I owe you an apology, he said. You were in this building in good faith as a professional, and you were operating under a false premise about who you were talking to. That wasn't fair to you. No, she agreed. It wasn't. I'm sorry. She considered this. The apology was clean. No caveats, no justification layered underneath it. She'd learned to notice that. Okay, she said. Okay, I accept it. She shifted her portfolio. The methodology review, is that a real assignment or is it a gesture? It's real, he said. Your analysis is solid. The methodology is sound. I reviewed it myself at 3 a.m, which is probably not the recommended peer review process, but I'm confident in the numbers. She almost laughed. Almost. You reviewed logistics freight routing models at 3 a.m. I was already awake. Obviously, she tapped her fingers once on the portfolio, thinking. The integration with Vail's full fleet operation is more complex than the slide suggested. My Columbus numbers are clean, but Vail's data has inconsistencies in how driver hours are logged across different regional managers. It's going to need about 3 weeks of data reconciliation before the model will actually hold. Tell me what you need to make that happen. Direct access to your operational database. A point of contact in your fleet management team who actually knows the system, not a liaison who knows how to email the person who knows the system. She paused. And I need it understood from the beginning that this is a joint analysis, not something that gets absorbed into Vail's internal team and represented with different authorship. He met her eyes. Understood. In writing. In writing, he agreed. She nodded once, picked up her portfolio, and stood. My flight is rescheduled for this afternoon. She'd changed it on her phone at 6 a.m., not entirely sure why, only that leaving at 6 a.m. had felt premature. I have calls until noon. After that, I can meet with your fleet management team if that's workable. I'll have Dana set it up, he said. He stood too. Victoria, she paused. The question you asked in the hallway, he said, on Thursday, about being in a meeting where you can tell who's going to be listened to before anyone said a word. She waited. I've been in those meetings my whole career, he said. I just didn't notice for a while that I was the one deciding who got listened to. She held his gaze for a moment. This was the part where a different kind of person would have said something reassuring or deflective or kind in a way that let him off the hook. Victoria didn't do that. Are you going to do something about it? She asked. I already started, he said. Good. She moved toward the door. Then we'll see how far it goes. She walked out into the hallway and the city morning came through the floor-to-ceiling east windows in long, low strips of pale light. And she stood there for a moment, alone, feeling the strange, settling weight of the last 6 days reorganizing itself into something that made more sense than it had 12 hours ago. She had not gotten what she came to Chicago for. The merger evaluation was ongoing, and after this morning it was going to move through a very different set of processes than she'd expected. Her hand hurt. She'd lost a week of sleep in a city that wasn't hers. She'd sat in meetings where her ideas had been redistributed like community property and been expected to perform equanimity about it. But the $31 million projection was real. Nathan Cole had reviewed it at 3 in the morning and called it solid. And there was something different in how this morning's meeting had ended. Not the cleaning up of a mess exactly, but the beginning of something being built correctly that had been built wrong for a long time. That mattered. She knew how to work with things that were being built correctly. She straightened her portfolio strap and walked toward the elevator. The morning moved around her in the way office mornings did. People arriving, the building filling with the sounds of keyboards and conference calls, and the particular friction of a large organization going about its work. She set up at a small meeting room on the 14th floor, the same floor she'd spent the week on, the same hallway, and ran her Columbus calls back to back until 11:30. At 11:45, there was a knock on the meeting room's glass door. It was Ernesto Guzman. He was holding 2 coffees from the supply kitchen at the north end of the floor, the one she'd asked Daniel about on the first morning, the one with the real machine and the uncertain creamer situation. He looked slightly formal, which she recognized as someone operating slightly outside their usual context. "Ms. Hayes," he held out one of the coffees. "Thought you might—" He stopped, like he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. She took the coffee. "Thank you, Mr. Guzman." He nodded. He started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, without quite meeting her eyes, "we all noticed. My team. The way you, the cart, and the glass, and—" He stopped again. It mattered. She looked at him. He was serious and slightly uncomfortable and completely sincere, and she recognized the specific difficulty of saying something real to a stranger when you weren't sure they'd receive it the right way. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He nodded again and left. She drank the coffee. It was good, the creamer situation having resolved itself in the form of a small carton of half and half someone had left in the communal refrigerator, and looked at the hallway through the glass. She thought about Ernesto's team, about Patrice, whom she'd watched get spoken to like furniture and hadn't had enough standing that week to address directly in the moment, which she'd cataloged as a failure even at the time. About the 37 exit interviews she hadn't known about until this morning, but which, now that Nathan had put them on the screen, felt like evidence of something she'd seen the shape of all week without seeing the full extent. She'd built her own company with a specific orientation. The idea that the people who actually did the work were not a cost to be managed, but the actual mechanism by which anything functioned. She'd learned this partly from growing up in a town where most of the people she knew were those people, and partly from being, for a significant portion of her early career, systematically underestimated in the same way she'd been underestimated this week, and understanding intuitively what it did to a person over time. You could absorb it, or you could let it sharpen you. She'd chosen the second option, but she understood that not everyone had that choice or had the circumstances that made that choice possible, and that the people who absorbed it were not lesser. They were just working under conditions that extracted more from them for the same return. The merger, if it happened, was going to need to reckon with that. She pulled out her laptop and started drafting a framework memo. Not for Nathan yet, not until the data was reconciled, but for herself. The way she always worked through new problems. Getting the shape of it on paper. What it would mean to integrate Halloran's operational culture into an organization that was in the middle of restructuring its own. What the risks were. What the conditions would have to be. She was 3 pages in when her phone lit up with a text from an unsaved number. Fleet management team is available at 2 p.m. on 14. Point of contact is Soren Adler. He actually knows the system. N. She stared at the text for a moment. Then she typed back. "How did you get this number?" The response came in 40 seconds. Building security logs all visitor phone numbers at check-in. "I'm sorry, I should have asked first." She considered this. Then, "Yes, you should have. 2 p.m. works." She put the phone down and went back to her memo. The meeting with Soren Adler at 2 p.m. was everything the summit meetings had not been. Specific, technical, productive, with a point of contact who actually knew where the inconsistencies in the driver hour logging came from and could explain the historical reasons for them. He was in his late 30s, wore his sleeves rolled up, had a whiteboard behind his desk covered in what looked like a month of accumulated problem solving. and spoke about logistics with the focused enthusiasm of someone who would do this even if no one was paying him, which Victoria recognized as the best possible sign. The regional logging variance goes back to a system migration in 2021, he said, pulling up a data table. 3 of the regional managers kept using the old input format after the migration because no one told them not to. So you've got about 14 months of driver data that's technically correct but categorized differently depending on which region logged it. Once you account for that, he clicked through to the next view. Your reconciliation window is probably closer to 2 weeks than 3. Victoria leaned forward. Can you show me the schema difference? He showed her. They spent 90 minutes in the data. At the end of it, Victoria had revised her timeline, identified 2 additional inefficiency vectors she hadn't included in the original model, and made a note to ask Soren whether he'd be willing to lead the technical side of the integration analysis, because he was good at this, and the work was going to need someone who cared about it being right. One more question, she said before she left. How long have you been at Vale? 6 years, he said. Have you been happy here? He looked at her, slightly surprised by the directness. Honestly, the past year's been rough. There's been a lot of... The management culture's been difficult. He paused. Today felt different. Yeah, she said. It did. She was back on the main floor at 4:15, waiting for the car service to the airport, when Nathan appeared in the lobby. Not from the executive elevator, from the direction of the service corridor, which she now understood meant he'd been somewhere in the building's operational guts again. He had his coat on, and he looked like he'd had a longer day than she had, which was saying something. He stopped when he saw her. How did the 2 o'clock go? Soren Adler's good, she said. You should make sure you keep him. Noted. He paused. The reconciliation timeline? 2 weeks, maybe less. I'll have a full revised projection in 3. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and was deciding how to frame it. I'll be back in Chicago in 3 weeks, she said before he could, for the preliminary integration report. I'll be here, he said. Yes, she said dryly. I imagine you will be, possibly in multiple capacities. This time he actually did smile. Small, brief, and surprisingly unguarded, the expression of a man whose face had forgotten to perform its usual function for a moment. It was different from anything she'd seen from him all week, which was interesting given that she now knew who he actually was. It was more human than the competence had been, less constructed. The car service arrived. She picked up her bag. Victoria, he said. She turned. He seemed to be working out exactly how much he meant to say. She watched him land on, "Thank you for staying." She considered this for a moment. I have a $31 million projection and a database full of mislogged driver hours, she said. Leaving seemed premature. Right, he said. She turned toward the door, then, because she was honest and had never really known how to be otherwise. And for what it's worth, Daniel was decent company. I meant that. She walked out into the Chicago afternoon. The city was doing its late afternoon thing, traffic thickening, the lake wind picking up, the light going that specific low gold that Chicago did in the hour before the evening came in hard. She got into the car and looked back at the building once, the glass tower with the brushed steel letters in the lobby, and thought about the hallway on 14 with the carpet seam that caught everything, and the supply kitchen with the real coffee machine, and Ernesto Guzman holding 2 cups and not quite knowing how to say what he meant. She thought about 37 exit interviews sitting in a folder nobody opened. She thought about what it would mean to build something here that actually lasted, not the merger necessarily, not even the projection model, but something more foundational than that. The harder, slower work of changing what a place rewarded and who it saw. She'd done it in Columbus. From 11 employees and a regional courier contract, and a lot of years of being the youngest person in the room, and the only woman in the room, and the person whose ideas arrived slightly before the credit did. She knew how long it took. She knew what it cost. She also knew it was the only kind of work worth doing, at the end of it. The car moved through the Chicago traffic toward the airport, and Victoria Hayes looked out the window at the city and let herself feel for the first time in 6 days something that was not quite relief and not quite hope, but lived in the general neighborhood of both. It wasn't resolution. It was the beginning of something, which was different, and which required more from her, and which she was, despite everything, despite the hand and the sleeplessness and the week of sitting in rooms that refused to see her, ready for. The flight home was smooth. She slept for most of it, for the first time all week. When she landed in Columbus at 8:40 p.m., her operations director had texted, "Hendricks back down. Also, your revised Q4 numbers look incredible. Also, welcome back." She typed back, "Thanks. Get me Soren Adler's contact in the Vale Fleet system by tomorrow morning." Then she got her bag and walked out into the Ohio night, which was colder than Chicago and quieter and smelled like home. And she let that be enough for the night. 3 weeks, she told herself. 3 weeks, and then back to the city with the building she now knew the inside of better than she'd expected, and the work that needed doing, and a man who had spent a week learning what invisibility felt like and had decided to do something about it. 3 weeks. She could wait 3 weeks. 3 weeks turned into 3 weeks and 2 days, because on the morning Victoria was supposed to fly back to Chicago, a pipe burst in Halloran's Dayton warehouse and flooded the dispatch floor, and she spent 14 hours in rubber boots coordinating emergency rerouting while her operations team dried out 6 months of paper records with industrial fans. She texted Nathan at 9 p.m. from the warehouse floor. Delayed 48 hours. Pipe situation. His response came in 4 minutes. "Do you need anything?" Not a question mark. Just the statement, flat and direct, which she'd come to understand was how he communicated when he meant something. She typed back, "A warehouse that doesn't have 40-year-old plumbing." His response, "I'll have Dana send the contact for the firm we used when we refitted the Evanston facility. Good people. Fast." She stared at this for a moment, standing in a flooded dispatch room with wet boots and a dead coffee cup and 14 hours of crisis management sitting on her shoulders. Then she typed, "That's actually helpful. Thank you." She didn't hear back for a while, and then, just before midnight, when she was finally in her car driving home, "The contact's in your email. Get some sleep." She didn't particularly, but it was a decent thing to say. She flew to Chicago on a Thursday instead of a Tuesday, landed at O'Hare in a light freezing rain that turned the expressway into a 40-minute crawl, and arrived at Vale Dynamics at 2 in the afternoon with her revised projection, her reconciled data set, and 3 weeks of accumulated thinking about what the integration framework needed to look like if it was going to be worth doing at all. The building felt different. She noticed it in the lobby first. Something in the texture of the place, subtle enough that she almost dismissed it as her own changed perception. But it wasn't that. There was a bulletin board near the security desk that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, with a printed notice about an employee feedback process. Not the template HR language she'd learned to recognize as performance, but something more specific, with actual named contacts and a timeline. The security guard who checked her badge made eye contact when he handed it back, said, "Good afternoon, Ms. Hayes," like someone who'd been told the name would be arriving and had decided that names mattered. Small things. The kind of things that didn't show up in quarterly reports, but showed up in how a building felt to move through. She took the elevator to 14 and found Soren Adler's office. A real one now, she noted, not the shared workspace he'd been operating from during her first visit. He was on the phone when she knocked, but waved her in and wrapped the call in under a minute with the efficiency of someone who'd gotten used to their time mattering. "Ms. Hayes," he stood, extended a hand. "The updated schema export came through this morning. I think you're going to like what the reconciliation did to the numbers." "Show me," she said, setting down her bag. They spent 2 hours in the data, which was Victoria's preferred way to spend 2 hours. Concrete, specific, moving through a problem with someone who understood the terrain. The reconciliation had done what Soren predicted, cleaned up the regional variance, revealed 2 additional optimization windows she'd flagged in her framework memo but hadn't been able to quantify without clean data, and pushed the conservative projection from 31 million to 37. "The aggressive projection," Soren said, pulling up the final tab, "is 52. Victoria looked at the screen. "That's not aggressive," she said. "That's what happens if you implement the full scheduling model across all regional operations simultaneously, which would be operationally insane." "Agreed," Soren said. "I'd phase it over 18 months, minimum." 24, she said. "You've got driver culture differences between the Midwest and Southeast operations that the model doesn't account for yet. You push too fast and you'll see short-term efficiency gains that collapse in month 8 when your turnover spikes." Soren made a note. 24 months. I'll put the phased rollout framework in the report. She looked at the numbers one more time. This is good work, Soren. It's your model, he said. It's both, she said, because it was, and she wasn't interested in false modesty. The model needed the clean data. You made the data clean. Both things matter. He looked slightly startled by this, and she noted the surprise in his expression and what it said about how he was used to being treated, and filed it. The full presentation was scheduled for Friday morning. Nathan had convened the executive leadership team, the restructured version, post-suspension, post-removal, with 3 new faces that Dana had briefed Victoria on via email the previous week, along with 2 board members and the head of fleet operations. Victoria's part of the presentation was the integration analysis. Nathan's part was the restructuring update and the cultural framework changes he'd been implementing for the past 3 weeks. She'd reviewed the framework document he'd sent her 10 days ago at 11 at night in the same flat statement style he used for everything. Attached is the draft framework. Tell me what's wrong with it. She'd spent an hour with it and sent back 7 pages of notes, which was more than she'd planned to send, but less than she'd thought. The framework was good, thorough, honest about the problems it was trying to solve, built around actual accountability mechanisms rather than the aspirational language that usually filled these documents. Her notes were mostly about implementation specificity. Where the language said leadership will prioritize, she'd written, prioritize is not a mechanism. What is the specific process? Where it said frontline workers will have a voice, she'd written through what structure, with what decision-making authority, with what protection against retaliation. He'd sent back a revised version 2 days later with every point addressed. She'd sent back, much better. He'd sent, tough crowd. She'd sent, you said tell you what's wrong with it. He'd sent, I did. Thank you. It had been the most functional professional exchange she'd had in years, which was not something she'd expected to think about a man she'd first met when he was pretending to be a janitor. Friday morning arrived cold and clear, the way Chicago mornings arrived in late April when the lake wind took a day off. Suddenly beautiful and slightly suspicious, like weather that knew it was being watched. Victoria was in the building at 7:30, which gave her 30 minutes in the small meeting room on 14 to review her slides and drink coffee and practice the specific kind of stillness she used before presentations that mattered. She had been in dozens of rooms like this. She knew the shape of them. She also knew that this one was different in a way that she needed to account for rather than perform her way through. This wasn't a hostile room. After 3 weeks of quiet back-channel work, the restructured leadership team had been briefed at a basic level on what the integration analysis would show. The board members had been sent a summary. The context was different from anything she'd presented in during the summit. She still prepared like the room was going to argue with her, because that was how she prepared for every room, and it had never steered her wrong. Nathan arrived at 7:55. He came to the meeting room first, which she hadn't expected. A brief knock on the glass, a pause at the door. Ready? He asked. Nearly, she said. Your framework document. Did you add the specific grievance timeline in the final version? 14 business days from filing to first response, 30 from filing to resolution or escalation. It's in the appendix. It should be in the main text. People don't read appendices. He looked at her for a moment. I'll tell Donna to move it before we print the hard copies. Good. She closed her laptop. Now I'm ready. The boardroom on 42 had been rearranged since the last time she'd been in it. Different configuration, less defensive than the rectangular standoff of 3 weeks ago, rounder in its feel, though the table was still rectangular. The new faces in the leadership team, 2 women and a man, all mid-level to senior, none of whom had been in the building during the summit week, had the alert, slightly cautious energy of people who understood that they'd been brought into something mid-rebuild and were still learning the shape of it. Harold Briggs was not in the room. She noted his absence without comment. Nathan had not mentioned him in any of the email exchanges over the past 3 weeks, and she had not asked. Nathan opened the meeting. He stood at the head of the table, not behind a presentation, not with a laptop, just standing, with the slightly too awake quality of a person running on less sleep than was advisable, but who had reached the functional plateau of it. 3 weeks ago, he said, this company held a leadership summit that exposed problems I should have seen years earlier. What I'm going to walk you through today is where we are in fixing them and what we're building next. He paused. I want to be clear before we start that what you're going to hear isn't a narrative of completion. We're not done. We're not close to done. What I can tell you is that we know what we're doing now in a way that we didn't 3 weeks ago, and that's the beginning of something real. He was not a natural speechmaker, she'd noticed. He was better in smaller rooms, in direct conversation, where the performance layer wasn't required. But there was something in the plainness of how he spoke, the refusal to make it more than it was, that carried its own weight. He walked them through the HR restructuring first. The external oversight process. The complaint audit, which had identified 19 cases requiring formal review, 11 of which had already produced documented outcomes. The new feedback mechanisms, including the one she'd seen on the bulletin board in the lobby, which had received 43 responses in its first 2 weeks of operation. 43 doesn't sound like a lot, Nathan said. It's 43 more than we got in the previous 2 years using the old process. He let that sit for a moment. People will use a system they believe will actually respond to them. Building that belief takes time, and it takes consistency. We're 3 weeks in. Then he pulled up the cultural framework document, with, she noted, the grievance timeline in the main text rather than the appendix. She watched the new leadership team members respond to it. The 2 women in particular, one from operations, one from fleet management, had the focused, note-taking engagement of people who were reading something they'd been waiting to read for a while. The operations woman, whose name was Diane, asked a question about the driver representation piece that was specific and good, and Nathan answered it specifically and without deflecting, and the exchange had the quality of people actually working through a problem together rather than performing the appearance of doing so. This was different from the summit. This was what it was supposed to look like. Nathan turned the floor over to Victoria at 10:15. She stood, connected her laptop, and looked at the room for a moment. I'm going to walk you through an integration analysis, she said. Not a merger pitch. I want to be clear about that distinction. An analysis of what a merger between Halloran Logistics Solutions and Vale Dynamics would actually require, what it would actually produce, and what conditions would need to be in place for it to be worth doing at all. She clicked to the first slide. Autostes metes. She clicked. I'm including that last part because I think analyses that skip the conditions for success portion are the reason most mergers fail. She'd been in enough presentations to know the first 2 minutes were when you established whether the room was going to listen or just wait. She watched the board member's posture shift slightly as she moved through the first 3 slides. The clean version of the dataset, the reconciled numbers, the phased rollout framework with its 24-month timeline and its specific operational milestones. She watched one of the board members, a woman in her 60s named Carla Reeves, who had the sharp, experienced stillness of someone who'd seen a lot of presentations and was waiting for the gap between what was said and what was meant. She watched Carla Reeves stop looking at her phone and put it face down on the table. That was the signal. Victoria kept going. She walked them through the driver scheduling model, the regional variance data, the retention projections, the $52 million figure with its 24-month implementation requirement and its specific failure conditions. She walked them through the cultural integration piece, which was the section she'd spent the most time on, and the section most analyses skipped entirely. What it would mean to bring Halloran's worker-oriented operational culture into contact with a Vale Dynamics that was still, 3 weeks into its restructuring, a work in progress. What the risks were. What the protections would need to be. What she would require, if a merger moved forward, in terms of structural guarantees for the Halloran team. She said this last part plainly because it needed to be plain. I will not bring my people into an environment that treats them as a cost. I've spent 7 years building a team with an 18% turnover rate in an industry where 60% is considered normal. That number is not accidental, and it is not transferable if the environment isn't right. The room was quiet. Carla Reeves said, "What would the environment being right require specifically?" Worker representation and operational decision-making at the regional level. A grievance process with teeth, not the aspirational version, the one with the specific timeline that Mr. Cole's framework document has in it. And a 12-month integration review with defined metrics, after which both companies retain the right to restructure the agreement if the conditions aren't being met. That's unusual, Carla said. The 12-month review clause. Yes, Victoria said. It is. A brief silence. I like it, Carla said. Victoria moved to the final slide. The conservative projection over 5 years, assuming a 24-month phased implementation and meeting the cultural integration conditions, is $214 million in operational savings across the combined entity. She let the number sit. The aggressive projection, which I don't recommend, is $301 million, and I don't recommend it because it would require implementation timelines that would burn out the people doing the implementation. And burned out people produce errors, and in logistics, errors are expensive. So she looked at the table. That's the analysis. I'll take questions. There were 14 minutes of questions, most of them specific and some of them genuinely good. The fleet operations director, a man Nathan had brought in from outside, who'd spent 20 years in the industry and had the unromantic, practical orientation of someone who'd actually driven trucks and managed drivers, and knew what the difference was between a scheduling model that worked on paper and one that worked at 5 a.m. in a frozen Midwestern depot, asked about the regional manager variance and whether the model accounted for seasonal freight fluctuation in the Q4 push. Not yet, Victoria said. That's the next phase of the analysis. If we're moving forward toward a letter of intent, I'd want your team involved in that piece. You know the operational calendar in ways the data doesn't fully capture. He nodded, looked at Nathan, and said, I want in on that. Nathan looked at Victoria. Yes, she said. The meeting ended at 11:40. People filtered out with the particular energy of a productive meeting. Not triumphant, because the work was too real and too long-term for triumph, but with the forward-leaning quality of people who had been handed something concrete to do. Soren left with the fleet director, already talking about the Q4 data. Diane from operations had her notebook out and was writing as she walked. Carla Reeves stopped at the door, looked back at Victoria, and said, Good work. Then to Nathan, She's right about the 12-month clause. Put it in the letter of intent. Then she left. The room emptied out. Victoria was closing her laptop when Nathan said from across the table, You changed the phasing timeline. It was 18 months in the document you sent me. I changed it when I talked to Soren. 24 is right. I know. He paused. I like that you changed it. Some people would have left the number that made the deal look faster. Faster deals that fall apart aren't faster, she said. No, he said. They're not. She finished packing her bag. The city was doing its late morning thing outside the windows. The lake steel blue today, the expressway moving at a reasonable speed for once. She was aware, in the particular way you became aware of things when the professional task was finished and the room got quieter, that there was another conversation that had been sitting underneath all the professional ones for 3 weeks, and that this was probably the moment it either happened or didn't. She was not good at waiting for things to happen. She'd never been. I have a question, she said, standing with her bag over her shoulder. Nathan looked at her. Okay. The week you spent in the building, in the uniform. She kept her voice even, the way she kept it even when she was asking something that mattered more than she wanted to show. Was any of that? She stopped because she didn't like how the sentence was forming. She started again. I want to know whether the way you paid attention to what was happening to me that week was professional or personal. The question landed in the room and sat there. Nathan didn't look away. He also didn't answer immediately, which she respected, because the immediate answer would have been the performed version, and they were both past performing at each other. Both, he said finally. It started professional. The professional concern was real. What was being done to your work was documented and wrong and needed to be addressed regardless of anything else. He paused. The personal part, another pause, was also real. I wasn't expecting it to be. She looked at him. He held the look with the same directness he'd had in the lobby 3 weeks ago, without deflecting into something easier. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. I'm going to need some time to think about the non-professional part, she said, separately from the professional part, which I want to keep separate because I'm not interested in either of us being confused about which is which. That's reasonable, he said. I have a company to run in Columbus, she said, and you have a company to rebuild in Chicago. And those two companies are in the early stages of a merger negotiation that needs to stay clean. I know. So, she adjusted the strap of her bag. I'm going to fly home, finish the Q4 seasonal analysis, and think about what I want to say about the non-professional part. And when I'm ready, I'll tell you. And in the meantime, we work on what we're working on." Nathan studied her for a moment. "You're very organized about things that most people aren't organized about." "I've been unorganized about things like this before," she said. "It didn't go well." She moved toward the door. "I'll have the Q4 supplement to Soren by end of next week. The letter of intent draft should probably be ready within 30 days if the board's moving forward. I'll have legal start on it." "Good." She paused at the door. "Nathan?" He looked up. "The framework document," she said. "The cultural one. It's good. I mean that." She said it because she did, and because she'd learned that people who were trying to do something genuinely difficult needed to hear that it was being seen, not because it was soft or kind to say so, but because it was accurate. Building that is harder than building the business case, and you're doing it right. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just the small adjustment of a person receiving something true that they hadn't fully let themselves need. "It's not done," he said. "No," she said, "but you started in the right place." She walked out. The elevator ride down was quiet, and she stood in it looking at the floor indicator numbers and letting the morning settle. The presentation had gone well. The integration analysis was solid, and she knew it. The letter of intent was 30 days out, the Q4 supplement was a week's work, and the cultural framework was a 3-year project that would be interesting and difficult and worth it. And there was the other thing, the non-professional part, which she'd said she needed time to think about, and which she did. Not because she didn't know what she thought, but because she was very careful about the distance between knowing what she thought and knowing whether what she thought was right. What she thought, if she was honest, the man had spent 5 days learning what it felt like to be invisible in his own building, and then had done something about it. He'd apologized cleanly, without caveats. He'd reviewed logistics freight models at 3 in the morning and found them solid. He'd moved the grievance timeline out of the appendix when she told him to. He'd said both when she asked a question that most people would have ducked, and he'd said it after taking long enough to say the real thing rather than the easy one. She'd known a lot of professionally accomplished people in her career. She knew fewer who were honest about what they'd gotten wrong. That mattered. She just needed to be sure it mattered for reasons that were about him and not about the particular vulnerability of having spent a week in a room that didn't see her and having him be, in that context, the person who did. She was aware of the difference. She was also aware that being aware of the difference was not the same as being certain about it, and certainty was what she needed before she said anything she meant. She walked through the lobby. The bulletin board was still there. The security guard said, "Have a good afternoon, Ms. Hayes." She said thank you and meant it and walked out into the cold spring air. Her phone rang before she reached the car. Columbus area code, her operations director. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Well, like we're moving forward well, or well, like the numbers were good, but there's a long road ahead. Well, both," she said, and got into the car. She landed in Columbus at 5:40, drove herself home because she'd never gotten used to car services in her own city, and was in her kitchen by 6:15 making dinner with the specific automatic efficiency of someone who cooked because it was necessary and not because they'd romanticized it. Pasta, whatever vegetables were in the refrigerator, a sauce that required attention for about 8 minutes and then left her alone. She ate standing at the counter, looking out at her backyard where the late April grass was doing its tentative spring thing, green at the edges, still brown in the patches where winter had sat hardest, the uncertain beginning of something. Her phone was on the counter and she wasn't looking at it. She thought about Ohio, about the town she'd grown up in, an hour south of Columbus, where her father had driven a delivery truck for 30 years and her mother had worked dispatch for the same company for 22, and where she'd understood from about age 12 that the people who moved things from place to place were not the people who got to decide anything about that movement, and had decided, with the specific, clear-eyed stubbornness that had been her dominant characteristic since early childhood, that she was going to be someone who decided things. She'd done that, she was doing it, and somehow it had brought her to a boardroom in Chicago where a man who owned the building had spent a week with a fake name badge learning what the floor felt like from a different angle, and had looked at the thing he found and not flinched from it. She thought about what he'd said in the lobby on that first Friday evening. "That's why you're the first person I've trusted in years." She hadn't known, at the time, who he was. She'd been talking to Daniel Brooks, janitor, East Wing rotation, 12 through 15. She'd filed the sentence away as something interesting said by someone she'd probably never see again. Now she knew who he was when he said it. She didn't know if that made it heavier or lighter, but it made it different, and she kept thinking about it. She washed the pan, dried it, put it away. Made tea, which she didn't actually want, but which gave her hands something to do. At 8:15, she picked up her phone and opened the text thread with the unsaved number she'd eventually labeled simply N. She typed, "The presentation went well. Carla Reeves told Nathan to put the 12-month clause in the letter of intent." She stared at this and then deleted it, because it was professional, and she'd said she was going to keep the professional separate. She typed, "I've thought about the non-professional part." She stared at this for a long time. Then she deleted it too, because she needed more than an hour with a bowl of pasta to have thought about it properly. She put the phone down and drank her tea. Outside, the backyard was getting dark, the uncertain grass going to shadow, the sky doing its Ohio evening thing, wide and unhurried and honest about what it was. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea and let the quiet of her own house settle around her, which she was usually good at. Tonight it was harder, which told her something she filed away for later. She picked up the phone one more time, typed, "I have a question for you," sent it before she could organize it further. His response came in 6 minutes. "Okay." She typed, "When Lily's picture day was, did you make it?" A pause. Longer than usual. Then, "I made it. I was 11 minutes late and she'd already had her photo taken, but I was there." She looked at this. Then, "She made me take one with her on my phone. She was upset about the gap in her front teeth showing. Then, she was wrong. The gap is good." Victoria sat with her tea in her quiet kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, on an April evening that smelled like spring trying to happen, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time settle into the general vicinity of a decision. Not yet. She wasn't ready to say it yet, but the shape of it was there. She typed, "It sounds like she is." Then she put the phone down, finished her tea, and went to bed, where she slept better than she had in weeks. The letter of intent took 31 days instead of 30, because on day 28, the legal team on Vail's side sent over a draft that used the word absorb 3 times in the integration clause, and Victoria sent it back with a single note in the margin. Halloran is not being absorbed. Revise the language or revise the deal. Nathan called her 20 minutes after the red line came through. "The legal team says the language is standard," he said. "The legal team is wrong," she said. She was in her car in the Halloran parking lot, engine running for heat, because it was early May, and Columbus hadn't gotten the memo that spring was supposed to have arrived. Standard language in merger agreements is usually written by the acquiring party to benefit the acquiring party. I'm not signing something that frames my company as a subordinate entity going in, because that framing becomes the culture, and the culture is the whole point. A pause. "I know." "Then tell your legal team." "I already sent them the revision note," he said. "I called to tell you that, and to say you were right to push back." She was quiet for a moment. "Oh, you were expecting a fight." "I was prepared for one," she said, which was different, and he'd come to understand the difference. "I know," he said again. "The revised draft will be in your inbox by end of day." It was. The word absorb did not appear in it. The integration language described a combined operational entity with defined structural autonomy for both legacy organizations during the transition period, which was accurate and respectful in what she'd asked for. She signed the letter of intent on a Tuesday evening at her kitchen table, scanned it, emailed it back, and then sat with the quiet of what she'd just done for about 5 minutes before opening the Q4 supplement she still owed Soren. The text from N arrived while she was mid-spreadsheet. Signed on our end, 32 days. She typed back, "You said 30. You sent back the first draft. The first draft used the word absorb 3 times. Fair." She put the phone down and went back to the spreadsheet, but she was smiling slightly, which she noted and didn't try to stop. The next 6 weeks were the busiest of her professional life, which was a high bar. The integration planning process required her in Chicago 2 days out of every 10, which meant Columbus got compressed into the other 8, which meant her operations director earned his salary in ways that she told him directly and that he appreciated because she'd learned over 7 years that people who worked hard needed to hear that the work was seen. The Q4 seasonal supplement went to Soren and came back with 3 good questions, and one excellent catch that tightened the model by about $2 million, and she sent him a note that said simply, "Good catch. That's yours in the report." He sent back a surprise thank you, and she thought again about what that surprise said about what he'd been used to. The work was hard and real, and she was good at it, and there was something grounding about that. The sheer concreteness of it, the way logistics problems had actual answers that you either found or didn't, the way a driver scheduling model either held under Q4 pressure or it didn't. And you could know which one was true if you were willing to look at the data honestly. The non-professional part was harder to be concrete about. She and Nathan talked, not constantly, not in the performed way of people who were building something and wanted to document it, but in the natural, accumulative way of two people who were thinking about the same large set of problems and had found it useful to think out loud to each other. He called when something in the restructuring hit an unexpected wall, and he wanted to think through it with someone who wasn't inside the organization. She texted when the integration timeline produced a conflict she hadn't anticipated and needed a second brain. They were both, she recognized, using the professional framework as a safe harbor, a legitimate reason to be in contact, a contained context that made the other thing less exposed. She was aware of this. She suspected he was too. Neither of them named it, which was either wisdom or cowardice, or some combination that she hadn't yet figured out how to classify. The moment it stopped being possible to avoid naming it happened on a Thursday evening in early June, on a sidewalk in Chicago's River North neighborhood, in the rain. She'd been in Chicago for a 2-day integration planning session. The second day had run long, a 3-hour deep dive into driver classification that had required Soren, the fleet director Victoria, and 2 people from her Columbus operations team on a conference bridge, all of them working through a regulatory question that nobody had anticipated and that had a real answer but required finding it. They'd found it at 6:45 p.m., and the conference bridge had disconnected, and the conference room had emptied, and Victoria had sat alone at the table for a moment feeling the particular bone-level tiredness of good, hard work completed. Nathan had appeared in the conference room doorway at 7. "The driver classification thing," he said. "Resolved," she said. "Soren has the documentation." "I know. He sent it 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Have you eaten?" "At lunch," she said. "That was 8 hours ago." "I'm aware." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite exasperation, but lived somewhere between them. "There's a place 2 blocks from here, nothing fancy. Good food, if you want." She looked at him for a moment. He was in his suit jacket, no tie, the slightly worn around the edges look she associated with his late evenings. He looked like someone who'd also been in a long day and hadn't thought too carefully about whether asking this was a professional thing or something else. "Okay," she said. It was raining when they got outside. Not heavily, just the steady, indifferent Chicago rain that came off the lake, and didn't particularly care who it inconvenienced. She had her coat, but hadn't thought to bring an umbrella, which was her own fault, and they walked the 2 blocks at a slightly accelerated pace that resulted in them arriving at the restaurant with damp shoulders and the mutual slight embarrassment of 2 competent adults who had failed to check a weather app. The place was small. A dozen tables, good lighting, the kind of menu that was short enough to mean they were serious about what was on it. They were seated near the window, rain streaking the glass, the street outside holding its own steady Chicago evening. They ordered. They talked about the driver classification resolution, and then about the regional manager training framework that was rolling out in the Vail Midwest operation the following week. And then that conversation finished, and the food arrived, and they ate for a while, and the rain kept going outside, and the restaurant filled up around them with its ordinary Thursday evening people, and somewhere in the space between the food arriving and the plates being cleared, the professional conversation ran out of material, and they were just 2 people at a table in the rain. It was Victoria who said it, because she was who she was, and waiting had its limits. "I've thought about the non-professional part," she said. Nathan looked at her across the table. He set down his water glass. "And?" he said. "And I've been trying to figure out whether what I feel is about you specifically or about the context," she said. "The week in the building, you were the one person who saw me when I felt invisible. That's a powerful context. It can create feelings that are about the context more than the person." She held his gaze. "I've been trying to separate them." "Have you been able to?" he asked. "Mostly," she said. "There's a version of this where I was responding to being seen, and anyone who'd seen me that week would have gotten the same response from me. But that's not what happened. What happened is you specifically, the way you think about things, the way you're honest about what you got wrong, the way you moved the grievance timeline out of the appendix when I told you to without making it a thing. She paused. The picture day text. Something in his expression moved. You didn't have to tell me about being 11 minutes late, she said. You could have just said yes. But you told me the whole thing, including the part that wasn't flattering, because that's how you talk about things. You tell the actual version. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her steadily. What are you saying? He asked, and the question was simple and direct, which was how he asked things when they mattered. I'm saying I like you, she said. Specifically, not contextually. She felt the slight vulnerability of having said it plainly, which she'd known she would feel, and had decided to say it anyway because that was how she did things. And I'm saying that the professional situation is complicated, and I don't want it to become messy, and I think we're both careful enough people to keep the lines clear if we try. I think so too, he said, but I needed to be sure you understood the distinction, she said. I'm not interested in being with someone because they have money, and I'm building something that benefits from proximity to that money. That's not, I know, he said. I need you to really know that, she said, because I spent years building my company in rooms where people assumed the only way a woman was in the room was because of who she was connected to, and I will not operate in a dynamic that replicates that, even privately. Victoria, he said, his voice was even and certain, the way it was when he was saying something he'd decided. I know, the thing that made me, he stopped, chose the word carefully. The thing that made me notice you, the first day, was the cartwheel. You put your portfolio down and helped fix a logistics problem because it was there and it needed fixing. You didn't think about whether it was appropriate to your status in the building. You just saw the problem. He paused. That's not a response to your money or your company, that's a response to you. She looked at him for a moment. The rain moved down the window behind him. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They were both quiet for a moment, and then she said, This is going to be complicated. Yes, he said. The merger process is at least 18 months. I know. We're going to be in a lot of professional rooms together. I know. If it becomes a problem for either of us, we say so directly. Agreed. She nodded once, picked up her fork, and ate the last of her dinner. He did the same. Outside, the rain kept going, and the restaurant kept filling up around them, and it was ordinary and real and not particularly dramatic, which was exactly the right way for something like this to begin. He walked her back to the hotel afterward, in the rain, both of them with their coat collars up, because neither of them had brought an umbrella, which was still their own fault. At the hotel entrance, she turned and looked at him, and he looked back, and they were both slightly wet and tired from a long day, and the moment was not cinematic, which she liked. I'll see you next week, she said. Tuesday, he said. Regional manager training? I'll be there, he nodded. Then, thank you for being direct. It's the only way I know how to be, she said. I know, that's... He stopped. I know. Good night, Victoria. Good night, Nathan. She went inside. He walked back into the Chicago rain. The 18 months that followed were not easy, and she would not have said they were, even on the good days. Merging two companies was the organizational equivalent of convincing two separate rivers to share a bed. The currents were different, the bottoms were different. The ecosystems that had developed in each one had spent years learning to function in a specific environment, and did not automatically adapt because someone had decided they should. There were weeks where the integration timeline slipped and the meetings got tense, and Victoria and Soren and the fleet director sat in rooms until 8 or 9 at night, trying to find solutions that held. There were weeks where the cultural work inside Veil Dynamics ran into the particular stubbornness of systems that knew on some level that change required them to give something up. But the structure held because the structure had been built carefully, and because the people doing the work cared about it being right more than they cared about it being fast. Ernesto Guzman's team got a formal voice in the quarterly operations review 6 months into the restructuring. Not a symbolic seat at the table, but a structured input process with documented responses and a follow-up mechanism that closed the loop. Ernesto himself attended the first session with the wariness of someone who had been promised things before and had learned to wait before trusting them. After the third session, when two of his team's flagged maintenance issues had produced actual protocol changes, and one of his cleaning staff's suggestions about supply rotation had been implemented and credited to her by name in the operations update, he stopped waiting. He told Nathan directly, one morning in the facilities office, that he thought the company had changed. Nathan said, "We're still changing." Ernesto said, "I know, but there's a difference between changing and knowing what direction to change in. You know the direction now." Nathan held on to that sentence for a long time afterward. Patrice, the cleaning staff member who'd been spoken to like furniture by the director named Whitfield, Michael Whitfield, whose performance review had produced a formal written warning and a required management coaching process, was promoted to team lead 8 months into the restructuring after Ernesto submitted her name with detailed documentation of her performance and the new HR system processed it through an actual review. She came to Ernesto's office when she found out, and he told her later that she'd stood in the doorway and not quite cried, but close, and that she'd said, "I thought they'd never see me here." He'd said, "They see you now." It was not a perfect story. Whitfield did not become a good manager because he went through a coaching process. He became a marginally less actively harmful one, which was something but was not transformation, and Nathan had known it wouldn't be. Harold Briggs resigned quietly 4 months in, with a severance arrangement that was fair and an NDA that was standard, and a conversation with Nathan that lasted 40 minutes and ended with Briggs saying, in the kind of voice that meant a man was looking at something he'd done and didn't like the view, "I didn't think I was part of the problem." Nathan had said, "I know. That's the part that's the hardest to fix." Briggs had left, and Nathan had sat alone in his office for a while afterward, feeling the weight of all the years of not looking closely enough, which was a weight he'd decided to carry forward rather than put down, because he thought carrying it kept him honest. Marcus Webb stayed. He was not the same HR director he'd been before. The restructuring had required him to do things that were uncomfortable and to hold himself accountable for what he'd allowed, and he'd done both, imperfectly and with the visible strain of someone who was genuinely trying to change a habit of conflict, avoidance that was built into his professional wiring. He'd never be a crusader, but he'd become someone who didn't look away, which was worth something and which Nathan told him plainly in their quarterly check-in. Soren Adler got promoted to head of fleet operations analytics 11 months in, which Nathan announced in a company-wide email that named the work specifically and attributed it correctly. Soren sent Victoria a text that said, "I think this might be the first time I've been promoted for work that was actually mine." She texted back, "Get used to it." The 12-month integration review happened in month 13 because month 12 had produced a freight disruption in the Southeast operation that required everyone's full attention for 6 weeks and left no bandwidth for formal review processes. When it finally happened, the numbers were within 2% of the phased projection. The cultural metrics, the ones that were harder to measure, but that Victoria had insisted on including, turnover rate trends, internal complaint resolution timelines, driver satisfaction survey scores, were ahead of projection. At the review meeting, Carla Reeves looked at the numbers and said, "The 12-month clause. Are either party exercising it?" Victoria looked at Nathan. He looked at her. "No," they said at the same time. Carla Reeves allowed herself a small, satisfied expression. "Good. Let's talk about year 2. The non-professional part was complicated, the way she'd said it would be, and was also, in the private spaces between the professional ones, something that neither of them had words for yet that were quite accurate enough. They were careful about the lines, the way they'd said they would be, and the lines held because they were both the kind of people who meant what they said and did what they said they would do. But there were Thursday evenings in Chicago restaurants with rain on the windows. There were late-night calls where the professional conversation finished and they kept talking anyway about smaller things, Lily's gap-toothed school photos, Victoria's father, who'd been a delivery driver and who she visited every few months and who had never quite accepted that she drove herself to the airport, the specific loneliness of being the person in charge of things, which was different from regular loneliness but was still loneliness and needed to be named every so often. Nathan talked about Claire sometimes, carefully, briefly, in the way of someone who had learned to carry something without letting it define his forward motion. Victoria didn't try to fill those silences with reassurance, because she understood that some silences needed to be exactly the size they were. He introduced her to Lily on a Saturday afternoon in November, 9 months after the lobby conversation and 4 months after the Thursday evening in the rain conversation, at a small cafe near his house in Lincoln Park. He told Lily that a person he worked with was going to have lunch with them, which was accurate and also completely insufficient, and Lily, who had her mother's eyes and the terrifying perceptiveness of a child who had spent years in the company of adults, took approximately 11 minutes to assess the situation and render her verdict. The verdict came in the form of asking Victoria, very seriously, whether she thought the gap in her teeth was still too noticeable for school photos. Victoria had looked at the gap with the same practical directness she brought to logistics problems and said, "No, it makes your smile interesting. Interesting is better than perfect." Lily had considered this, decided she agreed, and then asked if Victoria wanted to see the drawing she'd brought, which was of a building with windows and 2 figures in front, one with a briefcase and one with a cape. Victoria had looked at the drawing and then at Nathan, who was watching both of them with the expression of a man who was not yet entirely sure what he was feeling, but was feeling it clearly. "Who's this one?" Victoria asked Lily, pointing to the caped figure. "That's me," Lily said. "Coming to work with Papa someday." "You'd be good at it," Victoria said seriously. Lily beamed. After lunch, while Lily was at the counter investigating the dessert display with the focused intensity of a professional, Nathan said quietly, "She likes you." "She's deciding whether to like me," Victoria said. "There's a difference. She's still running the analysis." He looked at her. "When did you figure that out?" "About 4 minutes in," she said. "She's thorough. You should be proud." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his daughter at the dessert counter. "She is the best thing I've done," he said, in the simple, undefended way he said things when they were completely true. Victoria looked at him. "I know," she said. The year turned. The integration moved into its second phase. Halloran's Columbus and Dayton operations absorbed, no, she still refused that word, integrated into the combined entity's Midwest framework with less friction than any of the models had projected, largely because the people doing the integration had been the people doing the planning, which turned out to matter enormously. Victoria kept her office in Columbus. She kept her operational independence, as the letter of intent had specified, running the Halloran legacy operations as a defined division of the combined entity with her own P&L and her own team and her own accountability structure. She was not absorbed. She was present on her own terms, which was the only way she'd ever been present anywhere, and which Nathan had understood from the beginning. She was in Chicago 1 week out of 3, on average. On the week she was in Chicago, she worked out of the 14th floor, in a proper office now, not the borrowed meeting room, a real one with her name on the door, which had appeared one Monday morning without announcement, and which she'd looked at for a moment before going inside and setting up her laptop and getting to work. She'd mentioned it to Nathan at the end of that day. "The office," she said. "Whose decision was that?" "Yours," he said. "You've been working out of borrowed conference rooms for 8 months. That's not right." "You could have asked." "Would you have said yes?" She thought about it. "Probably not immediately. I'd have said I didn't need a permanent office because I wasn't a permanent Chicago presence." "Right," he said. "Which is why I didn't ask." She looked at him. "That's a little high-handed." "It's a little high-handed," he agreed. "Do you want me to take the name off the door?" She thought about it. No. There were things she still struggled with, which she thought was important to be honest about, at least with herself. The merger had changed the shape of her professional life in ways she was still adjusting to. The scale was larger, the decisions were heavier, and there were days when she missed the clarity of running a 300-person company where she knew most of the names and could walk the warehouse floor and feel the pulse of the place directly. The combined entity was nearly 2,000 people, and managing at that scale required systems and layers and trust in people she was still learning, which was right and necessary, and also sometimes felt like flying a plane by instrument when she'd learned to fly by looking out the window. She said this to Nathan one evening in his kitchen while Lily was doing homework at the island, and his mother, who Victoria had met 3 times, and who had the unhurried, observant warmth of someone who had watched her son be alone for too long and was choosing not to say anything about it, was reading in the living room. Nathan was cooking, which he did with the same slightly imperfect competence he brought to most practical things. Good enough to produce food that tasted right, not precious about the process. The scale thing, he said, without looking up from the stove. Does it feel like loss or adjustment? Both, she said. Some days one more than the other. Yeah. He stirred something. I felt that when we went from 200 employees to 800, you stop knowing people's kids' names. You stop knowing which specific person is the one to call when something breaks at 5 a.m. because you know their phone habits. He paused. You build new ways of knowing. They're different. They're not worse, necessarily. They're just different. When did it stop feeling like loss? She asked. He thought about it genuinely, which she always appreciated. When I trusted the people I'd put in place enough to believe they were doing the knowing that I couldn't do anymore. When Soren sends me the quarterly analysis, I know what kind of mind made it. I know it's right. That's a different kind of knowing, but it counts. She looked at him. You're better at this than you were a year ago. Than I was a year ago, he said. I was a disaster who had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for 3 years and calling it leadership. You were, she said honestly. Thanks for that. You said you preferred the real version. From the island, without looking up from her homework, Lily said, Papa was also late to picture day. I was 11 minutes late, Nathan said. It felt like longer, Lily said, with the serene accuracy of a child reporting historical record. Victoria looked at the table and didn't quite laugh. The night she told him she loved him, it wasn't on a riverside walk or under city lights or in any location that would look good in the retelling. It was in a parking garage, of all places. The same one on Wacker Drive where Nathan had paid cash for a daily ticket on the first morning of the week that had started all of this, though neither of them knew that at the time. And the parking garage did not know it either and had no opinion on the poetry of it. It was a February night, cold the way Chicago was cold in February. The specific full-body cold that didn't negotiate, that made every outdoor moment a transaction with the weather that you'd better have budgeted for. They'd had a difficult meeting that afternoon. A regional manager in the Southeast operation, who'd been slow-rolling the new driver classification policy and who'd finally been brought to the table, which had required Nathan and Victoria to be in the same room with a problem that tested both the professional framework and the trust they'd built. Because there was a moment mid-meeting when their instincts diverged and they disagreed directly in front of the regional manager, which was the right thing to do and had also been uncomfortable. They'd resolved it. Victoria's read on the situation had been right, and Nathan had said so when the meeting ended, directly and without caveat. And afterward they'd walked to the parking garage together in the February cold with the particular silence of two people who had just been through something real together and were processing the residue of it. At her car, she'd turned to say goodnight, and he'd been looking at her with an expression she'd seen developing over the course of 18 months. The one that had started as something careful and uncertain, and had gradually, through the accumulation of Thursday evenings and late-night calls and picture day texts and supply cart wheels and correct grievance timelines and 37 exit interviews and letters of intent that didn't use the word absorb, had become something clear and certain and fully present. She'd looked back at him. I love you, she said. I've been fairly sure for a while, and I wanted to say it when I was certain. He'd been still for a moment, the cold between them, their breath visible in the air. Then, I've been certain for a while, he said. I was waiting for you to be ready. I know, she said. That was the right call. He took her face in both hands, cold from the February air, slightly clumsy with the care of it, and kissed her in a parking garage in Chicago in the middle of winter, which was not romantic in any conventional sense, and was exactly right. Afterward, she said, Your hands are freezing. Your fault, he said. You made me wait in a parking garage. You didn't have to wait in the parking garage. I wanted to walk you to your car. She looked at him. He was red-cheeked from the cold and slightly rumpled and completely himself. And she thought about all the things she'd built and all the rooms she'd sat in and all the years of being the person who showed up early and stayed late and did the work no one credited her for. And she thought about a carpet seam on the 14th floor that caught everything, and a supply cart wheel that squealed until someone paid attention to it, and a man with a fake name badge who had spent 5 days learning what the floor felt like from a different angle because he wanted to understand the problem rather than just document it. Go home, she said. You'll freeze. Dinner Friday? He said. Lily's school thing is Friday. Saturday. Saturday? she said. She drove home through the Chicago winter, the city doing its nighttime thing around her. Steady, indifferent, vast and lit and fully itself. And she thought that this was what it looked like when something was built correctly. Not without fractures. Not without the places where the work showed and the joins were visible and the repair marks hadn't fully blended. But sound. Honest about what it was. Oriented toward the right things. That was, she'd come to believe, the only kind of thing worth building. Not the version that looked finished from a distance. The version that held when you got close to it. The version that could carry weight. She'd built that in Columbus from 11 people in a regional courier contract and years of being underestimated in rooms that didn't see her. She was building it again now, in a different shape, with more people and higher stakes, and a man who had once stood in a gray uniform in her building's hallway and heard her say, "I noticed things," and had decided that was worth paying attention to. Lily drew another picture that winter. A bigger one, with more people. She gave it to Victoria on a Saturday afternoon with the seriousness of a significant gift. It had the same building as before, blocky and many-windowed. But this time there were 3 figures in front of it. The tallest one had a briefcase. The shortest one had a cape. The middle one had a portfolio. And Lily had given her red shoes because when Victoria asked, "You always wear interesting shoes. It's one of your good things." Victoria kept the picture. She put it on her desk. The one in Columbus, not the one in Chicago, where she could see it when she was working late, which was often because she was still who she was and the work still mattered. Interesting shoes, a portfolio, a building with a lot of windows. 3 people standing in front of something that was being built correctly, taking their time, not pretending it was finished. It was enough, more than enough. It was the real thing, which was the only thing that had ever been worth having.